Telling the untold.
Fault lines.
Live from just outside of Washington, D.C., the capital of the incited states of America, it's time for the show that brings you more diverse views on the issues that really matter. In the adamantly independent corner, I am investigative analyst and political theorist Shane Stranahan.
In the lefty corner, I am the blisteringly unapologetic.
In the left corner, we have blisteringly unapologetic, admittedly combative, at times verbose, and currently absent political analyst Jamarl Thomas.
No, I'm here. My mic was just off. But thank you for doing it. As soon as you said it, I was clicking it back on. But let me try it again. Right. In the left corner, I am the blisteringly unapologetic, admittedly combative, and at times verbose political analyst Jamarl Thomas.
Get ready for the show that is your antidote to propaganda. We're both anecdotal and into data. It's Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. All right, let's do the news. Talking headlines now. European officials are racing to agree on who can visit the bloc as of July 1st. This is going to be based on how countries of origin are faring with new coronavirus cases. Americans so far are excluded from travel to the EU, according to draft lists seen by the New York Times. Twitter has put a public interest notice on a tweet of Trump's in which he addressed the Black House Autonomous Zone. In the tweet, Trump said, "There will be an autonomous zone in Washington, D.C. as long as I'm your... There will never be an autonomous zone in Washington, D.C. as long as I'm your president. If they try, they will be met with force," end quote. This is the second time Twitter has put a public interest notice on a Trump tweet. The first time as a response to speech they said, quote, "glorified violence," end quote. This time because the tweet contains, quote, "the presence of a threat of harm against an identifiable group," end quote. These notices don't prevent Twitter users from viewing the tweet. The noose in Bubba Wallace's garage was apparently a garage door pull rope that had been in the shared garage since October 2019. The only full-time black NASCAR driver, Bubba Wallace, defended his decision, saying the rope appears to have been fashioned in the shape of a noose. This follows a ceremony yesterday in which many members of NASCAR supported Bubba Wallace very publicly and prominently. The White House is hosting Polish President Andrzej Duda today to talk about energy policy, the COVID-19 response, and a military agreement that would lead to U.S. troops being stationed in the country. This visit comes just 4 days ahead of Poland's presidential elections on June 28th. Washington State has announced Tuesday that it will require people to wear facial coverings in public settings. Governor Jay Inslee reiterated that this will be a, quote, legal requirement, end quote. The announcement comes after King County, which has been the epicenter of the COVID-19 crisis in the state, officially moved to phase 2 as part of the governor's plan to restart the state's economy. The woman suspected of arson in the burning of the Wendy's in Atlanta, Natalie White, has been identified as the girlfriend of Rayshard Brooks, the man killed by police in a standoff outside that same Wendy's. White was arrested yesterday by the Fulton County Sheriff's Office, where she faces charges of arson. Senate Intelligence Committee wants a government-wide report in 180 days on UFOs, or unidentified aerial phenomenon, as they are now called. It wants to be, it to be unclassified. This is a big deal. A lot more on that later. For now, though, you're all caught up. That's the news. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan.
So,
all
Shane,
right, Jamarl.
Interesting news. I like that, especially the UFO one.
Absolutely. Yeah. Want to hear more on that later. Yeah, and we will in about 4 months from what that says.
Yeah,
6 months.
So it should be interesting, considering for the longest time they tried to pretend it didn't exist. But let's start here. I mean, there are more important things that are taking place right now, especially going around our society and the havoc and the chaos that's going out there, and the chaos and the havoc that's expected. I look at that and I watch that, and I think to myself, why don't we have a rational government? Now, understand what I'm asking for the moment. We have, 40 million people out of work, roughly as many people without insurance. And on top of having that many people without insurance, the government is basically going to pull the rug from under them with the modest amount of help that it was giving them going into the next month. Meaning there's a complete and utter, entire expectation that there will be a housing apocalypse. And the government doesn't care. It's as if they don't necessarily grasp what this means, the level of pain and havoc that is going to be a put on people. But more importantly, I don't necessarily think they even get the threat that is to our order and society itself. The price of water has gone up 80% over the past few years. People in the United States are now at the point where they're having difficulty buying water. On top of that, you have the Arctic, or Siberia, which was hot the other day. Like, your world is telling you something, and not just your world, your society specifically. Why don't we act rationally? If you look at Kennedy during the Cuban Missile Crisis, you can make an argument that Kennedy got us into that crisis based on the way he was engaging with those foreign powers, and after trying to have the CIA whack Castro over 100 times. Well, under that situation, it makes all the sense in the world that Castro, being a rational actor, will try to get help to preserve his particular government, in which case he is perfectly okay with going to the Soviet Union to do so. I'm making the point that it was trying to whack Castro that basically instigated that crisis. But Kennedy was a rational actor in trying to get us out of the crisis, and it wasn't this brash belligerence. Do you honestly believe that Donald Trump could have gotten us out of the Cuban Missile Crisis without a lot of people dying? I don't think so. And that should be terrifying to you. At the last count that I've watched, we have COVID-19 spiking in countries and states all across the United States. I mean, the list, there are more states where it is spiking than there are where it's either staying the same or not spiking. The society is going full speed ahead and opening. When I look at other countries abroad in Europe, they took aggressive action to ensure that the societies were made whole, even from the standpoint of their work or even from the standpoint of the testing. We were talking about South Korea yesterday, where South Korea was having drive-through testing because they were trying to track and trace in order to bring down the number of people associated with the disease. Germany, who has a large older population, suffered nowhere near the deaths of the United States. They used U.S. research to ensure that their country was made whole. We fought our scientists all along the way. Former Defense Secretary McNamara, in his phenomenal documentary, Fog of War, makes the point that rationality is not always rational, that something else is required to understand in situations. Now, McNamara had a crisis of conscience when he was pursuing the case of the Vietnam War. At one point, Kennedy was going to pull out. LBJ reads from the Riot Act. You can listen to the tape. It's pretty vicious. And basically saying we're staying in the war. We're getting more involved in that war. Now, the wild part about this is, at one point, McNamara has a breakdown. A man comes to his office, sets himself on fire in front of his office as a protest to the war. Why? Because that's a real thing. And he was trying to get across to him that you guys are doing this over and over and over again when you were bombing and killing in these countries. And some of those countries at the time, the country didn't even know that we were in there bombing. I'm trying to make the point that McNamara's argument is not entirely correct. Rationality is not an absolute. And implicit in his argument that you need something more than rationality is that his rationality is somehow absolute. It's not. Value is always tethered to something. And whatever your value is, whatever the priorities are that you have, your rational responses are going to go towards that value. The catch becomes, what do you value? If the only thing that you're looking at is how to pursue a war, is that war rational? Should you be engaged in that war? You realize the moment that you put your people in, they're going to be atrocities just by probability's sake. My point is, he's pursuing a course of action that is irrational, and you are making rational responses within the context of that irrational case, and you're expecting good results. In our country, we have a priority basically of cash, of the top 1%. Obama, I keep saying this, gave 95% of the income gains to the top 1%, while you have a population that went bust. Now, when I'm talking about homeowners and everything else, those homeowners were never made whole at the point this crisis hit, meaning their country never recovered. Year after year after year, for the last 40, 50 years, there was a war on the poor, unacknowledged, where for the most part, your standard of living didn't go anywhere while your bills and expenses continue to go up. What did go up is the upper class. Jeff Bezos, while 40 million people are out of a job, is on his way to be a trillionaire. Is that rational? Think about what I'm asking you for the moment. Think about the pain that is in your country. Think about what is taking place in regards to your living standards and what has taken place in your living standards over the last several years. While Obama was giving that much money to the top 1%, he was also killing 500,000 Syrians. Bush killed 1 million Iraqis. You have the selling of slaves based on Obama destroying that country. You have Afghanistan, where we've been lying for decades and attacking the body that is supposed to be instrumental to dealing with war crimes. In Venezuela, you have stolen money and literally putting sanctions on that killed tens of thousands while trying to install a random nobody as president. This doesn't get into the kill squads. This doesn't get into the banana republics. I'm making the point to you that our country doesn't care about really vicious things that it does, meaning the internals of the country. And while our country do those vicious things, it is also hollowing out the inside of the country with a priority towards cash as opposed to a priority towards ensuring human health and happiness. At some point, that needs to change. I suspect part of this is unaccountability, meaning the U.S. is not accountable to anyone. You're a superpower at that point. And the moment that you feel like you have a multipolar world has fallen away, well, you can do it whatever you want. When we went into Iraq, nobody did anything about it. When we went into Syria, nobody did anything about it. When we did Libya, nobody did anything about it. In fact, they even helped us. When those people flooded Europe, Europe didn't say one word about the fact that it was the United States' fault that all of those refugees were flooding into Europe, destabilizing their politics. The world stands pat. Think about what we were doing to Venezuela for the moment. Think about pulling out of the JCPOA. Every other European nation was against it. Didn't matter. The US was going with it, and Europe couldn't do anything to stop it. I'm making the point that the problem here, to some degree, is unaccountability. Think about your police force. You have, from 2013 to 2019, 99% of the killings that took place, cops kill like 1,000 people a year, 99%, no charges. Of the 1%, roughly 30%, I think it's a little bit more than 30%, get prosecuted and supposed to go, get some kind of sentence. Of 30% of that, go to jail. That's unaccountability. Does that unaccountability help your system or hurt your system? Meaning that cop knowing full well that 99% of the time there are not going to be any charges, and then even if there is, in that 1%, there's a 33% chance that he may get convicted and a 33% chance of that they may go to jail. Does that embolden him to take more aggressive action knowing that he's going to get off? Or does that stop him from taking aggressive action? Which does your society prefer that he does? Unaccountability is in part the problem. Think of your Democratic Party. The Democratic Party has told you you have nowhere else to go. This political party is supposed to have some kind of objective thing that makes them them. I'll bleed on a flag and die defending Medicare for all, or die defending Social Security, or whatever else. That's not happening. They are entirely and utterly relative to what the Republican Party is, telling you blue no matter who, with the blue no matter who basically allowing you to vote for them year after year after year, regardless of what they do. Bill Clinton, I'm going to get rid of Social Security, I'm privatize Social Security. We're still going to vote for him. Obama, 95% of the income to the top 1%. Still got to vote for the Democrat. That needs to change. Your problem is that basically there is no accountability within the context of the system, either from cops, either from the Democrats, or in this case, from America as a whole. And all of those situations breeds a certain amount of this belief that you can do whatever without any level of consequence being leveled at you. That's a problem. And I don't necessarily entirely know how we change that problem. I can say we change that problem internally in the United States by dealing with the political parties and getting rid of the unaccountability associated with just blue no matter who. That's not easy. My hope for these protests is that these people realize that the political system no longer gives them what they need, and in doing so, are out there trying to change it. Shane, what do you think? I know I'm leaving with a minute, but we have but a minute to go. But what do you think? I mean, do you think that that's where that unaccountability, where that notion of we can do whatever we want and it degrades and corrupts because you basically are not accountable?
I agree. I think that unaccountability is the problem. I would pinpoint 3 big areas, but let's go into a break. We're going to be back in just a minute. We're going to be taking calls in this next segment. So if you want to call in, 202-521-1320 is the number. Again, though, we'll be back in just a minute. Right now, you're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan.
Lines. By any means necessary is your guide to the movement and efforts shaping the world around us, from mass incarceration.
No longer am I interested in or concerned with prison reform. I am interested only in the eradication of prisons. To the back.
Narrative put forth by the Ferguson Police Department and by police supporters in general, 3 words came to mind: color me shocked.
Stay tuned to By Any Means Necessary, 5 days a week here on Radio Sputnik. Fault Lines.
And we are back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Real quick, 202-521-1320 is the number to call, 202-521-1320. Again, call that number. We'll probably pick you up and talk with you about something interesting. Want to give our numbers real quick. You can listen to us live from the beating heart of America, Washington, D.C. It's from 7 to 10 a.m. Eastern at 105.5 FM and 1390 a.m. You can also catch us in Kansas City, 102.9 and 104.7 FM. We're also live online, Spotify, our iHeartRadio, YouTube, a bunch of places. Jamarl, you were asking a big question there. You were creating a magnificent tableau of ideas that I think does portray the problem pretty accurately. We don't have accountability. I want to focus on 3 major areas in which the United States government is no longer accountable. It's no longer accountable to the rest of the world.
No.
It's no longer accountable to the American society, and it's no longer accountable to math, to the basics of economic growth and development,
Right.
productivity and science, all this stuff. So, I'll just go over these real briefly. Like you were saying, because we're the world's preeminent superpower, and we have been for, at least a couple decades here, arguably a little bit longer, because we're in that position, we have been for a while, we can't be held to account by other countries. The most that they can do is these weird little soft power things, attempted forays militarily, etc. There's no process by which our foreign policy can be made better other than at home. But the problem is, and I'll turn to the second point here, we can't seem to make our politics better at home. Again, civic engagement, as far as I can tell, is at an all-time low. The proportion of people who are voting in the elections has just continuously gone down over time. Robert Putnam, author of the book Bowling Alone, years ago, decades ago, remarked on the decline in civic society in America. Again, these wouldn't be civil society programs. These wouldn't be sort of governmentally administrated or NGO things. I'm just talking about people meeting privately in their local city council, people talking, people doing things together out in the streets that can lead to increased political engagement. I think that we've seen that. I think that genuinely since the late 60s, which wasn't just a political movement, there was a bunch of stuff going on there. I can't think of any time in the intervening period since like the summer of '69 or right around there where we've had any real civic engagement. You've had some of that with Barack Obama. You had some of that more recently with Bernie Sanders. But as we can see, Obama got co-opted if he wasn't co-opted before he came in, and Bernie Sanders got pushed out. So on both counts, it's like the agent of improving our standing internationally, we can't do that. The agent would be us voting, us making changes, us doing things on the ground level. We haven't done that. And then the third one, this is pretty obvious to anybody who's been looking at our debt ballooning. We're not economically accountable. And that's this much larger conversation. And we talk about that stuff again. We talked about the potential for that to end with de-dollarization. We've talked about what might have caused that, and that's kind of convoluted, complicated. But I think that these 3 areas, it's like we aren't accountable. We aren't accountable to ourselves. We aren't accountable to the rest of the world. And in some sense, we're deluding ourselves. We aren't accountable to reality in terms of what's possible. Anyway, though, that's my take.
That's the big one. I mean, we're not accountable to reality. And it's like And it depends on what reality is, right? I mean, like I said, it's not an absolute. Rationality is not absolute. If your goal in this is to maximize profit where you want to get monstrously rich, okay, then fair enough. That's going to be your objective. That's going to be your goal. And in doing so, you're going to care about that more than anything else, including the external or the negative outcomes for your population. And so, the things that we could do in our society, and I think around the world, like you said, we could have a hyperloop. We could have these like ridiculously awesome technologies, but that stuff costs money because money is the glue or the thing that holds us back in that process. Whereas real resources and finding something to do with those resources is a little bit more interesting to me. But a failure of imagination, a failure of will, a failure of ability. Some of this is education, though. Like, and I don't mean this in the people go to school sense. I just mean our society thinks all of the energy is just voting. Well, voting is just one metric. It's not the metric. And this is kind of why I'm so hopeful about the people being on the streets. You have all of this chaos where there is no voting solution, where the parties have basically co-opted the system. You have Democrats and Republicans who basically have agreed that, yeah, we're not going to deal with economics. We're not going to deal with the foreign policy stuff. We, for the most part, fundamentally agree. So what does the public do when they have two parties that fundamentally agree on an economic system that screws them over and a military system that screws over the rest of the world? And so it takes something else. And I don't necessarily think that something else is entirely energy being dumped into politics when there is no political solution for it, at least not immediately. Those people are in the streets. Those people are going to create a solution for it one way or the other. That's what I feel.
I feel the exact same way. That's the thing. I can disagree, and in a lot of cases, I do disagree with where some of the protesters are wanting to take this stuff. I have my own little ideological perspective, but the point is, I can't refute the idea that the reason that they're doing this, the reason that this is happening, is the decline, the gradual but intense decline of the health of American politics. That's just been going on for longer than I've been alive.
Let me ask you this: would you agree with this that it's a cause and effect thing? Like, I don't need to wring my hands about what happens in the sense of the protesters, because I look at it and say, this is a deficit that is being paid for decades of horrible stuff. Like, what's the balance of somebody who doesn't have a house or who doesn't have health care when they need it, or who's like brutally stressful? I was reading some of these horror cases where people were like, I just want meat. I just need meat. And they're like in these food lines, bread lines that look like they were back in the FDR age. Jeff Bezos is going to have $1 trillion. Like the billionaires of this country, over the time that all of these people lost their jobs, have made nearly $500 billion. That's obscene. I'm sorry. Especially when you have a situation where the only way they make that money is for people to work at their store, shop at their, buy their products. Meaning that they are somehow separating themselves from the rest of society in this kind of economic metric, despite the fact that that economic metric is made entirely by a system that is changed by a policy that is required to have various people functioning in that capacity, meaning working at the stores, buying the stuff, educating the population. That's not something they do. Have the streets. That's not something they do. Ensure that there are cops and fire departments. That's not something. Those things are acts of public will. And despite those things being acts of public will, we have a small body of human beings that says, yes, I'm going to take it and walk. And then they pay politicians, political figures, to basically set the rules and set the ideas so we can instantiate our gains and make it look like it's somehow a fair process. That's not a fair process. The capitalistic system and the governmental system that it's framed on is all acts of policy and public will. It's not created by God, and as such, it can be changed. I'm sorry, I think it's utterly and entirely abysmal that people are walking away with that much cash while there's that much pain in the public, and the government basically acts like we can't do anything to help the public. I'm sorry, that's a fail to me.
I want to go to callers in just a second here, but before I do, I just want to point out briefly, we're talking about people lacking meat. You remember an example of this irrationality, this inefficiency, and it's cruel, is a couple of months ago, the meat factories, not just meat factories, people were just killing animals willy-nilly.
They were shooting them in the face.
That's exactly because the supply was going to be too much, and so the price would go down, et cetera, et cetera. But if you look at that objectively, that's just a tremendous loss of life, literally animal life, for no good end. Animals, the factory farming system is its own whole beast. My point there is a lot of animals were born in this terrible environment and then were killed for nothing. It didn't go to anybody, and that's horrible. Anyway, I want to go to Michael.
The reason they killed them is because they couldn't have anybody to buy the product. Not that anybody didn't need the product. You had food lines in California. Half of the people in California had lost their jobs. You had food lines going out for miles or blocks or whatever. Those people needed food. And at the exact same time, these guys are shooting their cows in the face, crying while they're doing it.
It's true. It's true. It's horrific. If I were to look at that long enough, I would want to cry. But let's not do that right now. Michael from Sydney, you're on the air. What's on your mind, Michael?
Hey guys, I just wanted to pick up on a couple of points. The first is you raised the issue about Trump being censored on Twitter for his tweet. Well, I mean, on the issue of free speech, I take a very libertarian point of view. And I mean, basically, if you're going to censor Donald Trump, who is the president after all, whether you like it or not, and I'm not a supporter of Trump. I think he's abhorrent, but I don't think Joe Biden's any better. If you're going to censor Donald Trump, are you going to censor the State Department tweeting about sanctions against countries? Isn't that persecution or threatening war on countries? Isn't that threatening violence against a group of people? Are you going to censor Mike Pompeo, screaming about war on Venezuela? Are you going to censor John Bolton's new book, where he advocates for war on Iran and stuff like that? I mean, how far do you take it? Okay, and at the end of the day,
I agree with you. But let me ask you this real quick: if Donald Trump got on and he said, Ilhan Omar hates this country. Ilhan Omar is going to turn this country into Somalia. Ilhan Omar hates America. Do you think that could potentially incite violence? I mean, he's singling out the president of a 300 million person country, washed in guns, fanatics in many of these cases, and you only need one goofball. Should the president be able to basically screech out violence aimed at American citizens? Is that too far? Like, I agree with you. I'm more libertarian on this too. But to me, I look at this and think, we can't, you can't come out and say, go kill this person. That would be a fail, right? Would that be too far?
Yeah, I mean, you can't threaten, you can't say go out and kill people.
So,
but I mean, at the end of the day,
there are limits. No, I guess what I mean, but there are limits. So you do have limits.
But I mean, if you're going to censor Donald Trump, you got to censor the State Department too against advocating. I mean, Hillary Clinton laughed on national TV about killing Gaddafi. Madeleine Albright bragged about killing
I don't agree with it. Wait, just so we're clear, I don't agree with what Twitter is doing. I think Twitter is abhorrent. I'm asking something slightly different. I get into more of a philosophical thing. Even if I agree with the free speech tenet, and I even wrote an article on Counterpunch. Free speech is entirely for the speech you don't like, defending free speech. So it's not that. I'm getting more so to, are there limits? Is there a point where a person could say, hey, as the president of the United States, you should go out and kill this person? And if you say, no, you shouldn't do that, then it becomes, okay, well, what's the line? Where's that incremental place that you go from there where you say, look, you got to give all the leeway that you could possibly give, but you can't say, go incite violence. That's where I don't know where the line is.
Presidents of the United States have done that. They've openly said they're going to assassinate certain people in the past. Yeah. It's huge for the President of the United States. Right. Yeah. So I mean, I'll move on to the next point. The next point, you're talking about, money for the military and everything. Why is it that risk on the stock market can be socialised amongst the people, and the people, they have to repay the debt of the banks? And why is it the military can be socialised and the people have to fund the military, but medicine can't be socialised, education can't be socialised? Why is it all these other industries that are beneficial can't be socialised, but all these other industries that are not beneficial to the people are socialised?
Good point. No complaints, Shane.
I mean, my one comment there would just be with the military. It makes sense for the government to socialize the military because in some sense, the military is what the government, that's the baseline of what the government's supposed to do. On the other hand, there's this thing about cost disease. We spend way too much money, not just on weapons in general. It's not just that there are inefficiencies, but of course, we spend way too much money on these weapons because we are the sort of imperial overlord. So, I mean, I just wanted to respond briefly to the whole socialization thing. I think that in some senses, there are these natural boundaries, there are natural divisions of what the government should and shouldn't do. But then there's this legitimate question: should Medicare, should the healthcare industry as a whole be socialized? Does that fall under the purview of the government? That's a larger question, really popular question to ask these days. My take briefly before we go into the break is that I think we should focus more on technological innovation, focus on the sort of meat and bones improvements that improve the baseline level of health, all that stuff. The conversation, I think, about socialized medicine, it's valid. it's just a hornet's nest. That's my brief take. But we're going to go into a break in just a second, trying to bring Maram Susli onto the line. We'll be back in a minute. Right now, though, you're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan.
Fault Lines.
You're listening to Radio Sputnik.
Tune in to Loud and Clear with Brian Becker for the latest news, commentary, and political analysis. What's really behind the political and social crisis gripping the United States and the world? If you're tired of a superficial and shallow reporting for the mainstream media, here's your alternative. Forget the spoon-fed sound bites from pundits who know so little about so much. We deal with real issues. War in the Middle East, the military-industrial complex, U.S.-Russian relations, the rise of China, austerity, mass migration, global warming, and social justice movements in the United States and around the world, and much more. We bring you independent experts, analysts, and activists. Learn what really makes the decision makers take from the boardroom of Wall Street to the West Wing of the White House. Here is where the people fighting for chance speak and are heard loud and clear. 5 days a week on Radio Sputnik and SputnikNews.com. Fault Lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines. My name is Jamal Thomas. I'm here with my contemplative co-host, Shane Stranahan. You can listen to us from the beating heart of America, Washington, D.C., from 7 a.m. to 12 a.m. at 105.5 FM and 1390 a.m. You can also catch us in Kansas City at 102.9 FM and 104.7 FM. Shane, I don't know if you know this, seeing as this is our fifth show, but something in me died when Sanders flamed out of the race a few months ago. It was this kind of indelible hole in a place I can't necessarily identify. However, there's been a little glowing thing there ever since the protests. And I've identified that little bit of gurgling thing as hope. The protests sweeping across the United States and people yanking themselves out of political space, recognizing that their needs and demands can't be accommodated in the current political system, gives me hope. To discuss whether this movement is being hijacked, we're joined by political commentator and geopolitical analyst, Maram Susli.
She is.
How's
sadly,
it going today?
I don't think she's. Is she
Oh,
on
she's
or-
not here
I
yet?
don't think she's on. That's the thing. No, I
Okay.
don't. I think we're
Well-
trying to bring her on. We're trying to get her. We do right now. We have
Okay,
Tariq
we do have
on
a
the
caller,
line, actually,
though.
though. Yeah.
Oh, yeah, fair
Tariq
enough.
from New Orleans.
Excellent.
Yeah, Tariq, you're on the air. What's on your mind?
Good morning. I have two comments about the Middle East.
Keep checking the chat.
Yeah. In Syria, in the next 5 to 10 years after Galal said the same, the war stops there, that the land will become very available because Syria will become the hub for the Belt Road with China, and because of so much money and goods will be flowing throughout, they might, help the Palestinians and the Israelis come to a peace agreement. And I think that would be good because trillions of dollars would flow through there. Syria will be the hub for the world, which for transportation, trains and planes and 18-wheelers going through that way. And second comment, also dealing with the Middle East, is with the BDS movement. I noticed if an uptick on the social media with people promoting the BDS movement. I'm saying, if that attached with the Black Lives Matter movement that's in the streets, I'm not talking about the organization, but that's in the streets with the justice reform and whatnot. If it attached to that, then maybe that can bring peace to the Middle East too, where Israel and the Palestinians can have a meeting and they can come up with peace. Two-state solution or something that will benefit them and everybody else, and that would be good too. So it's a possibility that maybe we can have peace in the Middle East. That's all I want to say.
I really like that idea, Tariq. I mean, this is the thing with the Belt and Road Initiative. We've had a few people on. Within the last day or two, we had a caller who was talking. Actually, it was Alex Craner, who was talking about the endogenous growth model and the sort of competition between this model of development, investing in human capital, investing in human infrastructure, and the contrast between that and the sort of imperial model where you have a central hub that feeds off of the rest of the world and mostly seeks to enrich itself. That's I think the real big upside about the Belt and Road Initiative. That's why a lot of people are excited about it, and I'm honestly hoping that we can make this work. I'm also hoping we'll see how it goes. If the United States, Russia, and China, along with say India and the EU, other major countries across Eurasia, stretching through to the North Atlantic, North Pacific, et cetera, if we had a worldwide confederation of states that were working together on infrastructure, I don't know what it would take to get there. And, there's some worries about centralizing power too much, what that would lead to. But the upside just seems so huge to me. It seems incredible. I'm really hopeful. That's one of these principal hopes of humanity is that we can work together globally in a sort of worldwide federation of peaceful coexisting states with diverse political systems and all that stuff. Anyway, that's idealistic, but that's, I think, where a lot of those dreams lead to.
We can't even agree on healthcare. To put it in perspective, we're still having this argument about whether a government should supply healthcare, despite the fact that they're perfectly okay with killing people around the world with the military. I feel you. All things being equal, yes, I want the kumbaya world too. But that kumbaya world really does require a difference in human perspective. And one of those human perspectives is responsibility to one another. And without that, that never happens.
Yeah. I was thinking of billing myself as an interdependent instead of an independent, but I decided to be a little bit less confusing. But no, I agree completely. That's the thing. It's just a matter of how we get there. You know what I mean? Because I can see. I'll put it like this. You did say something
interesting, though. Oh, go ahead. I'm sorry.
What's that?
No. You said something interesting. You said it's something that we can do. And when you were referring to China, meaning you were looking at the world as a whole, not necessarily as an individual nation. That's good. I value that. I don't know if you noticed, if you did it. It's when you were making the argument, you said, man, it's something that we can do. And then you immediately went to this notion of Belt and Roads. Well, Belt and Roads is a Chinese thing. But you're right in the sense that if the world can come together, it will be a world thing. There's nothing to stop this world from developing whatever the world wants. Technology is the tool, right? It's kind of like Thanos. Thanos has the glove, and Thanos has absolute control of space, matter, and time. Thanos says, you know what? Instead of feeding people, we need to just get rid of half of the universe. That's kind of us. Basically, we have a situation where you have technology, which is a releasing factor. Anything that you need, for the most part, gets done through the wizardry and the magic of technology and science. And we decide to leave the other part of the country, poor, or the other, 80% of the world poor. I agree with you, Shane. I do want this kind of coming together of the world. It just takes something different in regards to our perspective. And I don't think our perspectives are suited to such right now. It's a clash. It's like we look at this othering thing where something that you were able to do, where you could say the Belt and Roads was a thing of humanity. Most people can't do that.
I think it's tough because we get so used to seeing each other as competitors, and there is obviously real competition. You can't put down, threat of warfare, threat of bloodshed. That's looming, and it has been for the whole history of civilization. So it's all these people who are critical of the human pursuit of greed. Again, taking it philosophical for a second, greed as a sort of survival strategy makes sense in this zero-sum or negative-sum situation. That we've grown up in through most of history. But I think the point is that the periods of technological growth where you create positive sums, you create more for everybody. And if we can keep that up, if we can do that in a sustainable way, if we can do that equitably, then you're able to escape from those emotional traps. You know what I mean? Now, how do we do that? I don't know. I think that a lot of the conversation right now, again, gets lost in this capitalism versus socialism argument. Fascism is this kind of looming boogeyman in the corner that each side brings down on the other when it doesn't like what the other's doing. But I don't know, man. I think if you look at it, there's a role for the government in setting policy. There's a role for society. There's a role for independent corporations or independent organizations. Again, I think we should put these things into perspective. These things have had historically organizational roles, and it's really just a matter of what's going to be the best thing. I think in addition, I'll close like this. In addition to a technological revolution, and in addition to more material technologies, I think we really need to develop our social technologies. I think we need to develop an understanding of our institutions. We need to develop tools that we can use to reform our institutions, because right now so much of the debate is rhetorical. So much of the debate is happening on this surface level of ideology or a single word like capitalism or socialism that hides more than it reveals.
Yeah, I agree with you. I hate those arguments. If a guy says, I like capitalism, I can't argue with that. It's subjective, right? It's like it's what you would be okay with in the world based on what you're not okay with. So it's like, yes, I'm okay with the capitalistic system, and I'm okay basically. And there's levels. I mean, the guy in Denmark, his idea of capitalism was radically different than what the people here in the United States is. And so you're right. I hate those kind of arguments. I like the concrete ones. I would say one thing though. It goes beyond just technology. Like, this was something I had to realize. It goes beyond just creating a technological environment where people can have this kind of kumbaya thing. There is a power differential in the way that people interact with one another. And all things being equal, in the same way that cash is a differential in regards to the economic space, well, power is a differential in its own space. And in the same way, people didn't like to give up, let's say, their slaves, or they didn't necessarily like to give up the Jim Crow era because they had a certain degree of difference, or apartheid because obvious reasons they had a degree of difference, or Israel and Palestine because obviously there's a power distribution there. People don't like to give those things up. Like, to them, they consider it losing something. So if they were at a 10 and somebody else was at a 7, the very fact that the person gets to 8, just their point of view loses, if that makes sense. Like, it's like the technological thing is great, but I'm telling you, it will be a fight to get people to give up any kind of space of power that they feel they're in. For example, John Bolton. Why do you think John Bolton doesn't like missile treaties? He doesn't like to undermine the power of the United States because it has an advantage.
Yeah. Yep.
It's the same reason. Like, that becomes like, so it's hard to, it's like if we're working with people and we try to essentially like, okay, we must have this advantage in regards to working with each other. Other countries are not going to go for that. Like, that's what I mean with the cultural thing. The missile treaties themselves are to some degree saying, okay, we are not going to allow this, despite the fact that we may have a differential and an advantage in our ability to be able to construct this stuff. We want a peaceful world. That's where we need to go.
I hear you. This is a
John,
very interesting conversation.
Yeah, you and I always get into these really good combos. So I always love this stuff. So we have a caller. This is John from Santa Fe,
I think,
John?
right?
Santa Fe. Is that right? Am I pronouncing it right?
Santa Fe, New Mexico. Let's do it.
Oh, that is Santa Fe, New Mexico. I'm sorry. I barely could see it. How you doing today, John?
I'm doing good. Hey, man, I'm a huge fan of yours. I followed you for like a year and a half, and I think you're a great YouTuber.
Thank you, man. I appreciate it.
My question is, and it's just because I can't find anything through the news, I haven't been able to go there on the ground, and I'm hoping that BLM is also addressing Yemen, Syria, Iraq, and the bailouts. Do you guys know if they are? I just can't tell from a Twitter screen. That's my question. Thank you.
Yeah, it doesn't look like it. Shane, do you have heard anything on it? I mean, they tend to be very specific at this point to defund the police.
Yeah, no, I have. I know that there's a bill, Tim Scott, in Congress, and I know that Democrats are pushing back against that. I want to look more into the details of that bill, and hopefully we can get somebody to talk about the contents of that and some of the implications of what those policies, if implemented, might lead to. But that's as far as I can tell the status quo here.
Well, that's just it though. He's talking about, see, right there. God, I love it sometimes when you say things. He's talking about Black Lives Matter in the sense of the protests, not necessarily the political space. And I think that's what's so fascinating about this. Under normal circumstances, when we're talking about politics or we're talking about the things that are going on, it's in politics. Like, it's not all of these movements on the outside of it. It's very specific into the political space. Whereas, does Black Lives Matter talk about some of the wars and stuff? I don't think so. But I just find it fascinating. But on that note, we have about 2 minutes left in the break. Shane, the Yemen thing, I do think Martin Luther King made a big point about saying the foreign policy was something that instrumental. If we remember back during the Vietnam War, in parts, people believe that the Vietnam War and his coming out against it was part and parcel to what ended up getting him killed. And so, it's one of those things where the foreign policy thing becomes somewhat of a big deal, especially if we are getting involved in things of power. Like you made the point of saying how we use our money. $1 trillion for the military. That money has to go somewhere. All right, so you're listening. The Fault Lines. Thomas and Stranahan will be back in a moment.
Fault Lines.
What's the most important hour of the day? It's the Critical Hour with Dr. Wilmer Leon. On this show, we don't just deliver the latest headlines. we divide the real from the fake. Tune in to hear from some of the most brilliant political minds of today. Get in-depth news and analysis that goes beyond the surface and digs straight into the details. Set your clock to the critical hour for a news perspective unlike any of those other guys. Tune in to the Critical Hour with Dr. Wilmer Leon, weekdays 6 to 7 p.m. Eastern, and catch us on Facebook Live. You're listening to Radio Sputnik.
Fault lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines. My name is Jamal Thomas. Like I said, I'm here with my contemplative co-host, Shane Stranahan. We have been going through the various stories for the day. Shane, did you have any comments on what we were talking about before, just going into this notion of, like the amount of money that we spend on these items as opposed to other items, and whether or not those movements are ever really going to deal with those movements in the same way that the civil rights movement started to deal with things like the Vietnam War?
Yeah, well, I mean, our economy is dependent on our foreign policy. And I think anybody who's critical of inequity in the American economy, in American society, at a certain point, you need to look at how our foreign policy props our economy up. And so it's a natural evolution, and then that becomes the real threat. People can people can justifiably criticize, the terrible conditions that a lot of people have lived in and still live in American society. The thing is, and there are a bunch of things you can do to change that within the country. But I think ultimately a lot of this stuff really does rest on our foreign policy. And it's not just in an ethical or abstract sense where, as we're killing people around the world, it's disheartening us and dehumanizing us at home. There might be some of that too. I think it really is just, it comes down to the bottom line. Before the Nixon shock, but especially after it, our ability to support ourselves has been dependent on our ability to maintain these, ties of trade, ties of corporate investment, etc. All of these post-colonial practices around the world. And then after the Nixon shock, you also have the idea we are the central reserve currency. There's a whole thing about the floating exchange rates where, again, as we're printing more dollars because other countries need them, other countries have to do something with those dollars. Usually what that means is reinvesting in America, in American assets. And it turns into this whole thing where in order for our economy to remain stable, we have to keep all these military bases around the world. And so I think, again, it's not the end of the road, but that's a step that a lot of people are stopped from getting to. That's a real critical thing if you want to actually address those deeper problems. That's my take on that.
No, I think you're onto something, and I think it gets more, I guess, sticky than that. I mean, like for example, many of the military bases or contractors, especially companies, are in the various districts, and if those congressmen say, okay, we're going to cut the military budget, does that mean cutting their jobs? And can a congressman take that vote if he knows that they're going to lose 10,000 jobs in his district? Oh man, that becomes very difficult. Very difficult. So we are. Okay.
Yeah, we're joined.
Yeah.
We're joined now by Wyatt.
Excellent.
Wyatt Reed and Sergio Torres. Yeah. We were down at the protest last night.
Can you hear us?
Yeah, we're here.
Okay, go for it, Shane. I'm sorry. I was just making sure he was here.
Oh, no, you're good. Yeah. So Wyatt and Sergio, great to have you on. Also good to meet you, Sergio. I'm just curious. We had you on yesterday, Wyatt. What were you seeing last night at the Black House Autonomous Zone? What kinds of interactions did you folks have there with the police?
Yeah, so it was largely peaceful for basically the entire day and well throughout the night. Mostly consisted of people kind of going back and forth, just sort of engaging verbally with the police who had overtaken the stretch of 16th Street going towards 8th Street, from I Street to 8th Street. Now this is, obviously of some sort of significance because this is the Black Lives Matter Plaza. This is the plaza that has been sort of, whether or not Mayor Bowser wants to describe it this way, it's been given to the protesters who come out against police terror and police repression. And so obviously yesterday, this area sort of, out of the control of protesters taken forcibly by police was something that really rubbed a lot of people the wrong way. So they were expressing that anger. And then at some point, police just kind of left. It was bizarre. It didn't really seem to make any sense at the time. A lot of people were sort of wondering what's going on, suspicious of what's happening. And, there were different sort of theories about what was happening, obviously. But then, pretty quickly on, a lot of the people who, went from just sort of jubilantly sort of celebrating this really recently retaken territory were caught up in police tasing someone and essentially getting drawn into the protracted engagement with law enforcement at, I believe it was 15th Street and H, Vermont Street and H. And at that point, a lot of people, it sounds like, took off, were sort of hesitant to engage with the remaining protesters, or rather the police. And those who came back stayed around for a little bit longer and ended up creating sort of a barricade situation there at the intersection of 16th and I. And after that point, police began to move in on bike squads, started coming in from both I Street, from the west and from the north. There were multiple sort of little incursions.
What time was this, by the way, Wyatt? I'm just curious. At what time of night or morning was this?
I'm going to let Sergio jump in here to explain the rest here real quick, but you can go ahead.
Thank you guys for the invitation. We were having really, I would say, we walk around downtown. Actually, we shut down 395 north and southbound for about 2 to 3 hours. It was a group of us marching around. We took 395 and stayed there for a while, shut down the whole highway, the interstate. When we came back to the White House, it was the kind of situation was getting a little bit agitated. The police was trying to first they move out. They cleared completely Black Lives Matter Plaza, what it's called today. And it was surprising for all of us, because it was like, why would the police leave? And they just surround, they were on Vermont and 17th Street, After that, we, tried to take back action on the stuff. And suddenly they just is one of the protesters because I guess he was too close to one of the agents.
And this will have been around 1 a.m.?
That was actually, about 12, I would say, 12:30.
12:30.
After that, we moved back to 16 and I Street. And then we kind of like have a barricade going on to protect ourselves from the police because it was suspicious for us that the police cleared the street and like for what reason, after they did the whole commotion yesterday, they built a fence around the church on 16th H.
Police erected a fence actually as soon as we came back into this recently liberated Black Lives Matter Plaza. They had retaken the St. John's church.
And there is police on the ground, on the church behind the fence, inside the church, protecting the church.
But finally, all this led up to sort of a confrontation when someone is arrested by the police after being told previously that they would back away from them. They swarmed them subsequently. People were frustrated, were upset, and in the hubbub, more people ended up like very quickly getting sort of manhandled, and then anyone who resisted to getting manhandled by the police was thrown to the ground. I have a number of videos last night of a lot of different police repression. It all started out, though, with a handful of arrests. And then from that, people were understandably upset. People started throwing stuff, bottles of water, a handful of other, small, medium-sized objects, certainly nothing lethal. And then at a certain point, basically the police just started pepper spraying everyone.
Yeah, that was,
go ahead.
That was the first move the police did, was to start pepper spraying everybody. And then the next thing I saw, it was flashbangs, detonating in the middle of the crowd. They start throwing this kind of like color bombs, and then they shoot us some kind of like paper. I actually have no CDs, but they shoot it out of a gun that looks like the one they used for the tear gas, but it was a white powder. It wasn't smoke. It was a white, like pepper powder. It was shot into the crowd. Actually, I recorded one of those in one of my videos, and you see the white powder being sprayed in the air after the detonation. And then they start pushing towards Vermont and I Street. At the moment, flashbangs can just keep coming like a rain. It was a wave of flashbangs. Actually, one of those moments, I was recording, and I was giving my back to the police, recording the crowd when the police, one of these officers, was coming behind me with the pepper spray to spray me. And I turned around when I saw him, and I put my phone to his face, and I say, "Why are you going to pepper spray me? I'm just recording." He just back up. They were coming completely in a way of, this was not trying to hold a protester that was being, creating any kind of situation. No, because people were completely pacific at this time, peaceful at this time. They were just like clearing the streets and oppressing everybody that was out there. Pepper spray.
Sergio White, quick question. Did you get the opportunity to talk to some of the people who were there while this was going on?
Yeah, absolutely.
What were they saying?
So many,
meaning, a few things. What were their reasons for being there, and what did they think of Mayor Bowser in response to what was taking place at that moment?
Yeah, so one of the most interesting conversations I had tonight was with someone who had never been there before, who really, as they told it to me, came down to the Black Lives Matter Plaza with the intention of taking a selfie and leaving. But in the brief period of time that they were down there, the police moved in, and they were subsequently caught up in just this massive sort of wave after wave after wave of police repression. And I caught up to them, 3 blocks away as we're sort of sitting down, and this guy sort of has his face in his hands and is wondering, like, he's talking to me just like, what did I just see? Like, what did I just experience? And, it's like, well, this is, this sort of the same thing that we've been experiencing for 3 weeks now. This, intentional sort of aggressions by the police meant to provoke a reaction from the protesters, which as soon as it's elicited, invokes a still greater response from the police. And it's this sort of intentional escalation of violence meant to turn into, God only knows, everyone ending up in jail or things changing. So we have obviously, some understanding of what the police have in mind here. But, in terms of the protesters, it varies because some of them have been out here for days and days and days. Some of them have been out here for weeks and weeks and weeks. And they, those that I have had the opportunity to speak with on repeated occasions have honestly been demonstrating some incredible growth in terms of leadership, in terms of political education and awareness. So I'm incredibly optimistic in terms of what the future holds for these brave young protesters holding Black Lives Matter Plaza.
And in the case of people that have the opportunity to talk to, they say that they are there trying to, they want Mayor Bowser, because we know by fact that Mayor Bowser said at one point that we didn't have money for housing or any other necessities that the citizens in Washington, D.C. need.
40.
And
that is the voice of Sergio Torres. He joined us along with Wyatt Reed. Sorry to cut you guys off. Hopefully we can get you back on soon to keep talking about this. As a reminder, Wyatt Reed is the producer for By Any Means Necessary, which airs on Radio Sputnik every day from 2 to 4 p.m. We'll be back in just another minute for 2 more hours of great radio. You have been listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Be right back.
Listening to Radio Sputnik, telling the untold.
Fault Lines.
Live from just outside of Washington, D.C., the capital of the Ignited States of America. It's time for this show that brings you more diverse views on the issues that really matter. In the adamantly independent corner, I am investigative analyst and political theorist Shane Stranahan.
In the left corner, I am the blisteringly unapologetic, admittedly combative, at times verbose political analyst Jamal Thomas.
Get ready for the show that is your antidote to propaganda. We're both anecdotal and into data. It's Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. All right, coming back around to the news, this time with Jamal, sort of. No monologue this time, so we'll do a little bit more back and forth. Although I want to point out to people, before we get into the headlines, we'll have Moran Sousley joining us probably later this segment, continuing into the next. She wasn't able to just a few minutes ago. We'll have her on regardless in just a few minutes. In the news, European Union officials are racing to agree on who can visit the EU bloc as of July 1st based on how countries of origin have fared with new coronavirus cases. Americans, so far, are excluded. We are, again, the world's hotspot for COVID right now. And according to Americans are excluded according to draft lists seen by the New York Times. Separate story here. Twitter has put a public interest notice on a tweet of Trump's in which Trump addressed the Black House Autonomous Zone, which we were just talking about with Sputnik producer Wyatt Reed and his friend Sergio Torres. In Trump's tweet, he said, "There will never be an autonomous zone in Washington, D.C. as long as I'm your president. If they try, they will be met with force." End quote. This is the second time Twitter has put a public interest notice on a Trump tweet. The first time as a response to speech they said, quote, "glorified violence," end quote. This time they said they did it because the tweet contains, quote, "the presence of a threat of harm against an identifiable group," end quote.
Yes.
Just a note, these notices don't prevent Twitter users from viewing the tweet.
Now, let me ask you this. Do you agree with that? Because we got into a little bit of this with the caller. And this gets into, I mean, look, Twitter is a private company, so let's postulate that first. And if they have an issue with threats against other people, and that's part of their just rule set, then Donald Trump, for the most part, is just a user like any other user. So, okay, and that's I kind of get it. But everybody can see it. He's the president of the United States. Should he be able to do this without any kind of pushback from Twitter?
Yes. And the reason is that he's giving information. And I think that Twitter, by doing anything to suppress that information, is actually increasing the risk of violence breaking out, if that makes sense.
Well, they're not stopping. Like you said, people can see it.
They can, but here's the thing. They can, but here's the thing. I've seen that these things get suppressed too. They put a disclaimer on it. I get it. But I've seen that these things get not hidden from people's Twitter feeds. That's what I've heard anyway.
Yeah. Oh, you mean like ghosting, where they
that
shadow
kind of thing.
Shadow banning. Yeah,
they do.
That's what I remember seeing with
the first tweet.
Yeah, I think they do stuff like that with YouTube, where they get to this thing of there's certain videos what they don't particularly like, and so it looks like the videos are getting less views and that type of stuff. Fair enough. I feel you on this. I think I agree. I think the catch here is I would want a more open platform in general. Like, I don't think Twitter should be kind of going after these people when they're putting... People can ignore the tweets if they want to ignore the tweets. I do take a certain dim view of violence, though. Where it's like Ilhan Omar. Donald Trump was making a bunch of tweets where it was clearly threatening her. Like, oh, she hates America. And you have a bunch of yahoos out there with weapons. Is that potentially damaging to her? So, I get it. I waffle on some of the stuff when I think it's putting individual people at risk. But all things being equal, I'm like, well, yeah, it's President of the United States. Let the man tweet.
That's the thing. That's the thing. All right, next story here. Yesterday, the day before yesterday, Bubba Wallace, NASCAR's only full-time black driver, said he found a noose in his garage. The day after, that's yesterday, NASCAR, as a sort of community, teamed up with Bubba Wallace, stood in solidarity, really walked in solidarity as they pushed his car around the track. And then today, actually technically last night, the FBI reported that the garage door that the noose in the garage was actually a garage door pull rope that had been in the garage, and it's a shared garage, by the way, since October of 2019. Wallace defended his decision, saying the rope appears to have been fashioned in the shape of a noose.
I agree with Wallace on this. I don't buy this.
Yeah?
Do you buy this? I mean, it's been there for like a year and just sitting there. Nobody. I don't know. It's possible. I don't know. I mean, look. Either way, it was a beautiful show for NASCAR, and they got the opportunity to show that they were in alignment on this particular issue, full stop. And I appreciate NASCAR for doing it. So,
yeah, I can see some ambiguity in the shape of a garage door pull rope. If it just has a loop on one end, that does look like a noose. Yeah. I don't know though. This does if it's not optics, if this wasn't something that he ginned up, and I think that's a pretty bad faith interpretation to say that he ginned this up.
Yeah, I don't think he ginned it up. I think
then it was perspective. Then it was about perspective, and I think that there's a conversation to be had there. Probably one to have later though, because I want to get through these headlines so we can bring Maram.
Yeah, go for it. I'm interrupting you. Go for it.
No, you're totally good. The White House is hosting Polish President Andrzej Duda today to talk about energy policy, COVID-19 response, and a military agreement that would lead to U.S. troops being stationed in the country, in Poland. This visit comes 4 days ahead of Poland's presidential election, which will take place on June 28th. Washington State announced Tuesday that it will require people to wear facial coverings in public settings. Governor Jay Inslee reiterated that this will be a, quote, legal requirement, end quote. The announcement comes after King County, which has been the epicenter of the COVID-19 crisis in the state, officially moved to phase 2 as part of the governor's plan to restart the state's economy. The woman suspected of arson in the burning of the Wendy's in Atlanta, Natalie White, has been identified as the girlfriend of Rayshard Brooks, the man killed by police in a standoff outside that same Wendy's. Natalie White was arrested yesterday by the Fulton County Sheriff's Office, where she now faces charges of arson. The Senate Intelligence Committee wants...
Just wait, I have to intercede on this one real quick. Solidarity. That woman basically burned down the Wendy's because she had this feeling that they were somehow responsible for her husband or boyfriend getting killed. Solidarity. Not saying it's right, but definitely.
I don't think it's right. That's the thing.
I didn't say I did not say it was right. I didn't say it was right. I said I don't think it was right. I said I understand. That's the difference.
Okay, for sure. Yeah, I mean, you obviously, we're our own people. My take on that is just... I don't think, Wendy's is kind of an innocent third party here. Yeah, that's the thing. That's the thing. Yeah. Anyway, the Senate Intelligence Committee wants a government-wide report in 180 days on UFOs, also called unidentified aerial phenomena now. It wants to be unclassified. This would be a big deal. Jamarl, that's your bailiwick. Sure, we'll be talking about that more later. Maybe not today's show, but at some point. Exactly. All right. And you know what? Those are the headlines. You're all caught up. You've been listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Now, I believe we are or will be soon joined by Maram Susli. I see, in fact, that she's here. Maram, are you with us?
Hi, guys. Nice to meet you, I guess.
Yeah, it's great to meet you, too. I think we've spoken briefly. I was a producer on Fault Lines. We spoke briefly. But Jamarl, I think this might be your first time talking with Maram. Is that right?
No, it's not. I was on Fault Lines when I met her once before.
Oh, shoot. Okay. Yeah, time flies. All right. Maram Susli is a political commentator.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
Oh, pardon me. Maram Susli is a political commentator and geopolitical analyst, and we're talking about a bunch of controversial stuff today, including whether the Black Lives Movement is a color revolution, what that looks like. It's an interesting question. We talked with Tom Luongo about that a few days ago. Yeah, that's what we're talking about. What's your take, Maram?
Well, I recently put out a video that I believe, having experienced what I did in the Syrian war and the Arab Spring, which we went through in 2011, just from my observation, what's happening in the U.S. is a color revolution. It's got all the signs. It's the same establishment media that feeds the same message, the corporate behind it, the Hollywood actresses that are supporting it, the fact that it's just before an election, the fact that Black Lives Matter happened also last time just before an election, the CNN backing it and kind of corralling it, even some individuals in the government, like the mayor of Seattle, for example, is backing it too. So I think from these signs, it seems that it is not something that is against the establishment. It is something that the establishment is pushing, which is pretty much the definition of the color revolution.
Well, when I hear color revolution, I hear that you have elements that are trying to basically topple the government. And this is, let me say it this way. I agree with you that there may be elements of media and so forth that are engaged and agree with the protests. But I think that has more to do with the history of this country in regards to race and this kind of watching Floyd get killed. I don't think that's something being manipulated per se. I mean, this was an organic uprising. I agree with you that it could be co-opted, but I don't agree that this is currently a color revolution. These are people that are just very angry, that are very poor, that basically are dealing with a certain degree of repression by what they consider to be an unfair police force, and a public that just so happens to agree. How does that count up to something similar than what happened to Syria, where the United States government was basically instigating a civil war?
Absolutely. So, if I may get clear, that I agree completely that there is a huge problem with police brutality in the United States, and I also agree that there is a disparity in the social situation between different races, and that there is a racial problem in the United States as well. And it's very obvious that people are also have a right and a legitimate cause to be upset. But from what I can see, that cause, that reason of being upset is being hijacked for an agenda. And yes, it is about overthrowing the government. But obviously in the U.S., people fueled, for example, there was some legitimate problems that were in the country. People were upset. There was economic problems as well. And they hijacked that and they empowered them, for example, Al-Qaeda, and now an autonomous zone, just like you guys have over there in the Chaz.
I noticed that. I did notice that.
Northeast of Syria. And that is backed by Antifa. The Kurdish groups that they're supporting are anarcho-communist Marxists. They follow the same ideology of Murray Bookchin that they're following over there where you guys are. So it's kind of the same playbook that they're using. And the purpose is to overthrow the government. Now, I think that the purpose they have for what's happening in the U.S. is to overthrow Trump. They want to make sure that he doesn't win the next election. That doesn't mean that Trump is a good guy or that he's ever done anything right. It's just, I'm just stating a fact without saying whether I support it or not. The Democrats want Trump out, and they're happy to allow, for a limited time, people to be upset about the problems that African Americans have. But as soon as they are no longer needed, you're not going to be allowed to be upset about those problems anymore. That's why I think it's a color revolution. Not because the protesters are getting paid or something like that. It's not like that. That's not what I'm trying to say. I'm not trying to say the protesters are even wrong. I'm just trying to say that as far as I can see, there is, people with that understand the wars, that they understand the empires, the economic reasons behind oppression in the United States. But those are not the voices that are getting amplified by the media. And they have control of the narrative. That's the problem. So I don't know what is the way out of that.
That's the voice of Maram Sousli. We're going to be back in just a minute, continuing to talk to Maram. Maram, again, is a political commentator and geopolitical analyst. You can follow her on Twitter and Facebook at Partisan Girl. That's Partisan Girl. Again, we'll be back in just a minute. You've been listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan.
Fault Lines. Want to talk? Get in touch with us at radio@sputniknews.com.
Epidemics and pandemics could kill millions of people, and they actually did. Centuries ago, deadly outbreaks called the Black Death, the Plague of Justinian, and the Spanish flu ravaged countries, empires, and whole continents. Some of these diseases are still present around the globe. Others have become a thing of the past. Discover how these ancient and not-so-distant outbreaks from previous centuries differ from modern-day SARS, MERS, and coronavirus pandemics. Listen to our new series, Outbreak, the deadliest epidemics in human history, this week on Radio Sputnik.
Fault lines.
And we are back again. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We're joined by Maram Susli, but I want to get this out of the way real quick. You can listen to us on the radio in Washington, D.C. at 105.5 FM and 1390 AM. You can also, if you're in Kansas City, listen to us 102.9 FM and 104.7 FM. You can also find us online, Spotify, YouTube, iHeartRadio, Spreaker, wherever great podcasts are found. Regardless, though, we're currently joined by Maram Susli. She is a political commentator and geopolitical analyst. We're talking about Black Lives Matter and whether it's a color revolution. And I'm honest, Maram, I'm kind of leaning towards it being a color revolution. Now, again, like you're saying, I think that what that means isn't that there aren't legitimate grievances. It isn't that there is this real base of instability and inequality in America that we haven't done nearly enough to address. Centuries old, but it's been, in some ways, at least in the public eye, it's been, if not getting worse, at least the attention that we're giving to it has been increasing. I see that happening right now, but I also see the political outlet for that apparently is to elect Joe Biden, who in 1994 wrote the Crimes Act, and again, who I just would see as, if anything, being like literally worse than Trump on this issue. So I don't know what this is going to turn into, but I'm a little bit worried, like you are, I think, that this is an establishment coup. Maybe if not literally, just figuratively, potentially, but we'll see. What's your take on that, Maram?
Well, I think, let's consider what the solutions are. I think if somewhere there's a grassroots push to boycott the election, to give us a message that those two candidates are unacceptable, the situation is unacceptable, and that there's no confidence in the fact that Biden, even Obama, like an so-called African-American president who is supposed to have the interests of Black lives, didn't do anything to solve the situation. Eric Gardner died under his watch. So he's the one that's bombing African countries. So if he was like that, what's Biden going to be like? That's not going to solve the issue. So in my view, the only solution here is to have a vote of no confidence and have a boycott the election and demand a complete overhaul somehow. But I'm also, as a Syrian as well, I'm also quite concerned about the autonomous zones and the propaganda that is being pushed in those autonomous zones that is very, very supportive of the Balkanization of Syria. The propaganda in those zones is like, we have to replicate, this is coming out of them, not me, that we have to replicate the Rojava autonomous zone in Syria. And that is the ideal anarchy utopia, in their words. So I'm concerned that, once Biden wins and he has all these young people that have been brainwashed into this ideology, that he'll say we have to maintain the occupation of Syria indefinitely in order to protect the Kurdish communist anarcho-autonomous zone called Rojava. And they will all back him. Because even Chomsky, the hero of the anarcho-left, backs this U.S. occupation of Syria for the sake of this autonomous zone.
Yeah, I disagree with Chomsky on that. I agree. So I agree with you and disagree with you. So Joe Biden is going to want to stay in Syria forever, but that has nothing to do with what's taking place here. That's a whole separate animal of the U.S. trying to maintain some kind of hegemonic dominance in the region. But I even agree with you with the Rojava thing. That's kind of like a little placeholder of force projection in the area. But I radically disagree with both of you with the revolution stuff. I mean, this is not a coup if it takes place in the context of an election. And I don't want Joe Biden to win any more than I want Trump to win. And I agree with you, Maram. I think it needs to be pulled out. I keep saying people need to pull themselves out of the political space and stand under what you want. And I don't think people are going to necessarily do that. By the same token, I don't think Black Lives Matter is on the board for Joe Biden. Joe Biden is going to do everything that he can to co-opt this movement. By the same token, I do think that group understands that Joe Biden was the one who wrote the crime bill. I guess I don't think it's entirely fair when you have a society of mass inequality and a government that basically has checked out of the process, and you have people who are going to be evicted to the tune of millions. Maybe those people should look for a change of their governmental system if it can't readdress their concerns. Is that not a fair case? And should that be considered a revolution in that case? I mean, or should that be considered people just trying to reprise their government in the way that they go about, trying to get it to represent their interests?
I mean, it has the potential. Well, in terms of Biden in Syria, it's all about how to sell it. The way that Trump's selling it is we're there to sell the oil, and that appeals to his right-wing demographic. For Biden, it'll be we're there to save the heroic utopia of anarchy in northeast Syria. So just about selling, but you're right, they're going to stay there no matter what. In terms of, when I say it's a color revolution, but I don't necessarily mean that there's no hope to push out the influence of, the left-wing liberal, the neoliberal establishment. Right. They're not really left-wing. The neoliberal establishment in the United States. And there is, the Zionist lobby even been on the record as trying to infiltrate Black Lives Matter. And there are some individuals who are part of that. They're influencers inside Black Lives Matter that are Zionists. So I think that there is still potential to push them out and to introduce better representatives, better influencers, and demand that they be highlighted. That's just my suggestion. So when I'm pointing out that this is a color revolution, it's a critique in the hope that it won't be one.
Yeah, no, I can definitely see that. I mean, problem is our political system, like the whole conversation that we're having assumes, isn't letting us create genuine change. I think the point of a protest, it's not just to raise awareness. In some sense, it is a representation of how people are boycotting the political system. But boycotting is a kind of negative action. You're rejecting the status quo. You're rejecting what some group or entity or agency is doing. The problem is, how do you productively, positively create something that's going to improve the system? And I think that's the potential.
No, I'm sorry. I'm sorry. No, I'm sorry. I interrupted.
No, it's. I think that's the question. I mean, the question of what is the potential of this movement? Does it have potential? Where is it going to go? Ultimately, I think it's going to come down to whether this political movement gets concrete enough. Stops having these larger, abstract, sort of rhetorical conversations just in an attempt to build public awareness or to build a public movement. Because if that doesn't turn into something concrete, then in the long run, that just leads to kind of an ennui, or a depression or a despair, as people have tried and tried and tried again, but have continuously failed to make change. I think that's part of what we've seen going on with these waves of protest. Again, the last Black Lives Matter arguably started right around 2014, really saw an upsurge before the last election. And it's exactly because I think that this movement has such potential and value that I think it's extremely important that we move beyond that negative boycotting phase and into a productive, creative phase where we're creating policy proposals, where we're pushing things down the road, where you're getting into Congress, you're having local meetings, regular local meetings, that kind of thing across the country where it counts. I think there's the potential for that. It's just a matter of how we make it happen. But until that happens, I'm going to have to put this under the color revolution category. It seems like the establishment has pretty much as a whole, across the board, left and right, thrown its weight behind this. People are critical of the rioting and stuff on the right, but the general policy agenda, the movement as a whole, is basically taking on. I mean, again, public opinion has shifted significantly just in the past couple of months. But again, it's a question of whether that's going to actually turn into concrete policies.
I would say a few things. Boycotting is not always a negative action. I mean, I don't think boycotting Israel and their subjugation of the Palestinians is a negative action. I think that's a positive act. Will that take on larger policy prescriptions? Yes, it does. And Black Lives Matter.
I just want to disambiguate real quick. Sorry, I don't mean to interrupt, but real quick. I just mean I don't mean negative as in not pleasant or bad. I mean it as in it's a rejection of something. It's not a creation of something. Whereas positive actions
I see.
are
Fair enough.
You're creating a policy. You're doing something like that. That's what I meant.
No, that's fair. That's fair. Okay, that's fair. But that's not necessarily a negative thing, by your own definition. I mean, them saying we reject the system, that's a start. I don't need to necessarily wring my hands and say this needs to move faster. It is not for me to do. This is basically taking 40, 50 years in the making for the public to finally get to the point of saying we're done. And our political system has been so thoroughly discredited that those people go out into the public. If it takes them a while to get their sea legs and to figure out what they want, fair enough. It's been, a few weeks. From the standpoint of France, they've been protesting for like a year. So I'm not, they do have policy demands in regards to defund the police. It is allowed. It is, all sorts of cacophonous and everything else. But let's be clear. Those things take time to develop and materialize and mature. And I don't want it to fade out. It's one of those things that it might, but give it time. It's only been a short period of time. And I understand what you guys mean. When you're saying color revolution, you're not necessarily saying in the bad sense of these guys are toppling the government in this kind of the grand way of running on Washington, D.C. with guns. I think your point is that there's aspects of the political system that would like to use this movement to get rid of Trump. Is that fair?
That is fair, yes. And it's not just that. They want to create a different climate going forward in the United States. And it's not necessarily that one that's going to actually benefit poor people, for example.
One thing, one of my producer kind of made the point about Martin Luther King. He says you have a controversial opinion about Martin Luther King. Could you share it? I want to hear it.
Yes, okay, absolutely. If you listen to have you heard of this documentary called The Lobby that was done by Al Jazeera, which sometimes a broken clock is right twice a day. But,
yeah, it's scathing. That documentary is scathing.
They hit a mic and they went into the Zionist lobby and they recorded their voices. And one of them said that, she spoke to the leaders in the Black Lives Matter movement and very influential people to try to stop the Black Lives Matter movement from joining in with BDS, the Boycott, Divestment, and Sanctions Against Israel movement. So they want to break apart solidarity between Black Lives Matter and Palestinians. One of the things that she was saying was that she got the speechwriter for Martin Luther King to write articles for the Huffington Post about why Black Lives Matter should support Israel and not Palestinians. This is the guy that wrote the I Have a Dream speech. And he's writing this stuff like during the occupation and the apartheid in Israel, which, by the way, doesn't allow Palestinians to ride on the same bus as Israelis. And there are black Palestinians, if you like, that also cannot ride on the same bus as Israelis by virtue of being Palestinian. So this is a complete hypocrisy. And unfortunately, you have a very influential Zionist lobby in your country, and they get to decide which heroes to highlight. And while you have Malcolm X, who was, supportive of Palestinians, he's basically in an unmarked grave. In the meantime, you have Trump and Pence visiting Martin Luther King's statue every year on Martin Luther King Day. And what do we have some of his last words, unfortunately, maybe he would have changed his mind as he got older, was that he supports Israel and not Palestine. He supports their right to exist on Palestinian land. So, and he said that Israel was the only democracy in the Middle East, things like that, which, as far as I believe, that they would force, if you listen to Cynthia McKinney, which was in Congress, the Zionist lobby at that time would force black people who are influential in politics to side with them Otherwise, they would just be cancelled. Like, they would silence them. They wouldn't allow them to have money. They wouldn't let them rise into prominence. And I have to ask, who chose to have those voices highlighted and someone like Malcolm X's voice not highlighted? Who chose Martin Luther King Day over Malcolm X Day? And it's the same people that are currently trying to co-opt Black Lives Matter. And it's a symbol, it's important. Because
that's Maram Susli. Great conversation. You can follow Maram on Facebook and Twitter at Partisan Girl. You can also find her on YouTube. Actually, Maram, real quick, how can people find you on YouTube? What's the best way?
Oh, please just Google, put on search Syrian Girl Partisan.
Okay, beautiful. You can also support her on Patreon at patreon.com/Syrian Girl, just like that. We'll be back in a minute talking with Lucy Commissar more about Bill Browder, John Bolton's book, which mentions Browder and the Magnitsky Act. Again, we'll be back in just a minute with Lucy Commissar. Right now, though, you have been listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan.
Fault Lines. We are above all the latest developments, and we don't take any sides. Radio Sputnik, telling the untold.
Shooting from the lip.
We're taking no prisoners here. Real opinions for real people.
Where we bring you people with controversial views, and instead of trying to catch them out,
we actually let them expand on their views.
What's going on in British politics, European politics, and indeed in world politics as well. And wherever you are, whether you're a UKIP supporter, a Tory or Labour, everything is in turmoil.
John Gaunt.
Shooting from the lip.
Fault Lines.
And we are back. It's Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Before we get into our conversation with Lucy Commissar about Bill Browder, Sergei Magnitsky, and John Bolton, who know they'd be tied together, I just want to throw out this. You can listen to us in Washington, D.C. at 105.5 FM and 1390 AM. You can also listen to us in Kansas City at 102.9 FM and 104.7 FM. You can also listen to us online through your computer, your phone, your tablet, whatnot, on YouTube, Spreaker, Spotify, iHeartRadio, Stitcher, wherever great podcasts are found, basically. All right, with that out of the way, we have Lucy Commissar on the line. Lucy Commissar, friend of the show, longtime guest. She's an investigative journalist focusing on corporate and financial corruption. She's also, as far as I can tell, one of the world's preeminent experts on the Browder fraud and how that ties into the wider financial system. Lucy, thanks so much for joining us.
My pleasure.
All right, so we're going to be talking about John Bolton's book, again, released just yesterday. He mentions Bill Browder and Sergei Magnitsky in there. I think also we're going to be going back over the Browder story. I also want to get to Rima Starova, who is a pivotal figure. Little is known about her. She was an early figure in the Magnitsky story, and I think in some ways, if you see her testimony, if you look at what she did, we'll get into it, it's revelatory. But regardless, I think maybe we should start with John Bolton. You wrote an article about John Bolton's book. Apparently, he was talking about Browder and Magnitsky. Can you tell us what he wrote?
Where it happens, in the room where it happened, is the July 2018 Helsinki meeting between Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin. And the Justice Department had just indicted agents of the GRU, GRU, the Foreign Military Intelligence Agency of the General Staff of the Russian Armed Forces. It charged them with hacking into the Democratic National Committee computers and releasing the information to influence the 2016 election. You remember the email showed how the DNC was supposed to be neutral with really working for Hillary Clinton against Bernie Sanders in the primary. They certainly didn't want that to get out. Though it was hardly a national security issue. It was a problem of a crooked Democratic National Committee. And then, so they're saying that they did it. Now, it's interesting that the U.S., and that was 2018, but the U.S. intelligence assessment, which was written in January 2017, that's a year and a half before, says, talking about this question of who hacked the computers, who interfered with the election, all of that, they said, we have no proof. Where do they say it? In the headline? In the first paragraph? No, it's in an annex on the very last page, which in journalism speak is called burying the lead. And they said, in effect, we have no proof. I have a copy of that on my website, in this story on the website, which shows you where they said, but we don't have any proof. But it didn't matter. The Justice Department brought the case, but they dropped it. They folded because the Russians contested it, and they demanded discovery. You were allowed to do that in this system. You're allowed to get discovery means you can demand evidence that the other side has. Show proof. The Justice Department dropped the case when the Russians asked for actual proof. So this is what is happening. This GRU indictment has just happened, and there's the meeting. So Bolton writes that Putin offered to try the GRU agents and let the Mueller investigators come to Russia, that was still going on, to do their work, as long as there was reciprocity with respect to Bill Browder. So what Bolton writes is, quote, so long as there was reciprocity with respect to Bill Browder, a businessman whose lawyer in Russia, Sergei Magnitsky, had been arrested and killed by the Putin regime. So the question is, where is he getting this information? Does he really know it's fake? Is he just getting it from somebody in the State Department who gives him the line? Because we know Magnitsky wasn't a lawyer. Browder admitted that in a deposition in U.S. federal court in 2015. That's already been said. This is a couple of years later. That Magnitsky didn't go to law school, didn't have a law license, and in effect, he was the accountant who worked for Browder from 10 years before Browder says he hired him. He worked for him from 1997, handling his tax evasion and fraud against the Russian Treasury. And the testimonies are in U.S. federal court. And the testimonies say about Magnitsky, education, economist, workplace, auditor. So Browder lies, and the promotion of this is part of Bolton. What Bolton says here is just promoted. This is interesting on both sides. What we have found now, in this case, both the Republicans and the Democrats promote this lie, and nobody ever puts up evidence because we have a bipartisan Russophobic foreign policy, and that is what comes across in this book. The only thing that Bolton doesn't like in this area about Trump is that he's not as Russophobic as Bolton would like him to be. And Bolton also writes, Browder, now a British citizen, had done well financially in Russia, but Magnitsky's murder, quote, this is all a quote, and the actions taken against his investments moved him to launch an international campaign against Moscow. So Bolton doesn't wonder why Browder is now a British citizen. Does he care? The IRS calls him a tax expatriate. And the reason, of course, he shredded his passport, his U.S. passport, because he had done well financially. He didn't want to pay U.S. taxes. Now, there was no Russian action against his investments unless Bolton is referring to normal tax collection. And Browder actually never claimed any action against his investments. But he didn't want to pay taxes in Russia either. And so he filed fake returns claiming $40 million in false deductions. The court ordered him to pay up. He refused. The Russians refused to renew his visa. Now, CBS TV did a very funny report. I think it's tongue-in-cheek. In 2012, and the picture in there, which you can find online, is 5 citizens who left the U.S. to avoid paying tax, William Browder. And they say, quote, officials with the U.S. Department of State had no serious plans to assist Browder find a new home in 2006 after he renounced his rights for tax reasons. So that gets to that. You know, some of this stuff is, I don't think Bolton cares a lot about Browder. It's just it's part laziness, but it just fits with the line. So why bother to find out the truth? So then more about Bolton. He's talking about Browder. He persuaded Congress to pass a law that enabled the U.S. to sanction Russian human rights violators. Several other countries followed suit. But actually, the Russian victims were low-level tax investigators, court officials, medical staff. It has nothing to do with human rights. The legislation was to block the Russians from collecting what now adds up to nearly $400 million in evaded taxes. And then Bolton says, this is interesting to me, Bolton says, the way Putin saw it, Browder had given Hillary Clinton's campaign foundation and other parts of the Clinton galactic empire some $400 million that he had basically stolen from Russia, which got Trump's attention. It was all hot air, but Trump was very excited about it. Now, there's no transcript of the conversation, and it seems to be misreported, or perhaps Putin misspoke. It was Browder's clients, the Ziff brothers, who had contributed to the Democrats, which at the time meant the Clinton campaign. So maybe these two points were being pushed together. But this is the first time I heard the claim Browder or the Ziffs gave money to the Clinton Foundation. And more interesting, there's the 400 million number. That's the first time I saw it in print, and Putin got that right. It's the combination of the tax evasion and it's the tax refund fraud against the Russian treasury, which Browder completely he invented a story about it to hide the fact that he's the one who did it. He claims that Russian officials did it, never had any evidence, and but it's clear now that he did it because the guy that was arrested for organizing this in Russia and was sentenced to 5 years in prison, he said that he worked with a guy that he only knew as Sergei Leonidovich, who brought him documents he needed. Well, Magnitsky's name is Sergei Leonidovich Magnitsky, and this guy had no reason to be for or against Browder in his testimony. I mean, he was on trial. He wasn't going to get anywhere except going to prison, which he did. But that's very interesting. So these two, these items show that Browder created this massive fake story to protect himself. So to me, those were the most interesting parts. There's another part where Bolton shows he doesn't really know what he's talking about. They were going back to Grew and Mueller. So he says, Putin raised the 1999 Mutual Legal Assistance Treaty. Putin said Mueller could take advantage of the treaty, and Russia should be able to take advantage of it to pursue Bill Browder for his crimes as he had related to Trump during their encounter. So these are called MLATs, and Mutual Legal Assistance Treaties. They're used all over the world. Bolton appears ignorant of that. He says Putin's description of what might be possible under the treaty was a long way what it actually provided, but by the time we explained it to the press, Putin had scored his propaganda point. Well, he doesn't explain it to us in the book. It's really very simple. It's an exchange of documents, and each Justice Department or Justice Ministry is requested to provide documents about whatever or whoever the other side is investigating. So it's really not very complicated, and it's certainly not propaganda. And details would have helped, but of course, once you get into details, you probably show that your propaganda accusation is really not true. And now it could be that Putin didn't explain it right. But I think it's pretty simple. And by the way, some people have raised the question, well, he's not an American citizen. Well, it's not about extradition. The MLATs are only about sharing documents, about sharing information. It's not even asking the other side to do an investigation. It's just to say, look at your records and send us the documents. The Russians probably wanted bank documents that showed how Browder moved money stolen from Russia into the world financial system. Now, we know that the CIA keeps tabs on the world's financial system, so it really does know everything that's going on. We first heard about this when it was discovered that the CIA knew what was going on in the bank that was handling the accounts of Chile when Pinochet was the dictator of Chile.
Lucy
And
Commissar, let's come back to this. Lucy is a fount of knowledge, as everybody who's been listening can hear. She's an investigative journalist focusing on corporate and financial corruption. We're going into a break right now, but we're going to be back with her in just a minute. We'll keep going on that. We can talk about Chile. We can come back to the probably the Trump Tower meeting, talking about Natalia Veselnitskaya. Also, there's just this weird set of events happening between 2016 and 2017, 2018. Regardless, we're joined by Lucy Commissar. We'll be back in just a minute. You've been listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan.
Fault Lines.
Tune in every Wednesday to Loud and Clear with Brian Becker and John Kiriakou for a regular segment called Beyond Nuclear, where Brian and John discuss nuclear issues, including weapons, energy, waste, and the future of nuclear technology in the United States, with Kevin Camps, the radioactive waste watchdog at the organization Beyond Nuclear. Listen on Wednesdays right here on Radio Sputnik.
Fault Lines.
And we're back again. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. You're also listening to the voice of Lucy Commissar, who's an investigative journalist focusing on corporate and financial corruption. We're talking about Bill Browder, Sergei Magnitsky, tax fraud against Russia, a geopolitical conflict between Russia and America, and how that appears to have been aggravated by John Bolton, who also wrote about Browder and Magnitsky in his recently published memoir, The Room Where It Happened. Again, we're talking with Lucy Commissar. Lucy, I kind of interrupted your train of thought. You were talking about Chile and the CIA, the overthrow of Pinochet. That was going somewhere interesting, and I was curious to hear how that tied in. Could you please continue?
It's only evidence that the CIA does know what's going on in the world banking system. And we know from the NSA spying, pretty much the USA has its fingers on all kinds of electronic traffic back and forth. They know what's going on. So probably they wouldn't give a lot of that to the Russians, but the point is the Russians were asking for documents. Now, there was one other last thing I would want to mention that he talks about. It's not Browder, but it's part of the Russia meddling, because he says, it's funny, he needed to pick his way through the Democratic MSNBC minefield, because you can't really look like you're agreeing with them, but it does turn out that the mainstream, the Republicans and Democrats agree on this. He had some advice for Trump. Trump should say, on this issue of the Russian meddling, Trump should say there was never any Russian collusion. Of course, that's what the Mueller report was talking about. And Russian or any other foreign meddling is unacceptable. Now, that seems to first he said that Trump should say he supports the intelligence community. There was never any Russian collusion, and Russian or other foreign meddling is not acceptable. Now, that seems to counter the first point, because the intelligence community said in its 2017 report it was all about Russian meddling, right? And he's supposed to say that he supports the intelligence community, but there wasn't any. But if you look on the last page, which I referred to before, it's Annex B, and this is a long report, which you can get online. You get it on the commissarscoop.com link to on this story. It says, judgments are not intended to imply that we have proof that shows something to be a fact. Assessments are based on collected information, which is often incomplete or fragmentary, as well as logic, argumentation, and precedents. That's their assessment are based on logic, arguments, precedents. And it says, high confidence in a judgment does not imply that the assessment is a fact or certainty. Such judgments might be wrong. I am quoting exactly from Annex B on this report, this famous report, assessing Russian activities and intentions in recent U.S. elections. That in the last page is saying, by the way, we don't have any proof and we could be wrong. And this is what the media, that's what their media is basing. This is the MSNBC line, that there was Russia meddling, and they are saying, well, we don't have any proof. I think that's really quite important, and also relates to what Bolton says, because he picks up the Russophobic line.
It's insane. And again, that's coming from the Office of the Director of National Intelligence, who presides over the intelligence agencies of the United States, at least officially, at least formally. But yeah, that's shocking. And that's also reflective of CrowdStrike, who a lot of these reports were based on. They were the DNC's internet contractor They were the ones who investigated the DNC servers. If you remember, Comey was asked about that. He mentioned that the FBI never personally investigated those servers. They never personally inspected them. So all evidence came through CrowdStrike. And if you look at CrowdStrike as a company, when they release their reports, many of which, pardon me, I'll say this, at least one of which we've debunked extensively. It was just flat out wrong. It had to do with artillery being used in Ukraine. But regardless, if you look at CrowdStrike's reports, it's circumstantial. It's like you're saying, it's not that they have proof. It's that they're fitting these pieces together. And the question, I think, is why are they fitting these pieces together in this way if they don't have proof? Whose interest are they serving when they're trying to put this all on Russia's plate? That's at least where my mind goes.
Yes, but even more specific to what we're talking about, the head of CrowdStrike, Sean Henry, the CEO, his company examined the DNC server. He lied and said the Russians were responsible. But he, in December 2017, he told the House Intelligence Committee, run by Representative Adam Schiff, that there was no evidence of who had, quote, exfiltrated the data. But Schiff kept the testimony secret till it was finally released with the testimony of other witnesses just in May, just a month ago. So
Yeah,
they knew
that
it was.
They buried that, and they knew for going all the way back for like 2 or 3 years that it was bogus. Meaning the entire time that they were screaming Trump and Russia, they knew. Like you say, Henry was the one who basically said so. He was the one who was running CrowdStrike. Also, there was situations where CrowdStrike redacted certain information going to the FBI.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, again, CrowdStrike, I might have misunderstood your question. CrowdStrike was the primary source for the FBI. It was the primary source for this whole media narrative that started in mid to late 2016 that, was ongoing pretty prominently until Russiagate seemed to have petered out within the last couple of years. I might have misunderstood your question.
No, I was asking to guess. No. I was asking to guess. It was a verifying question. There was reports that basically the FBI, in getting the information from CrowdStrike, there were certain parts that CrowdStrike decided to redact from the FBI itself. Has there been a situation where a company, private entity, basically said, we're not going to show something to the FBI? Or for that matter, the organization that could basically descend upon Roger Stone's house like a compound had no capacity to get their hands on the servers. Has this happened that we're aware of in our modern history where we have this kind of massive case that is supposed to take place, but the instruments of the federal government didn't necessarily use the tools to go after and do a legitimate investigation?
What about the FBI doing an investigation itself of these computers? The DNC did not allow the FBI to look at its server, its computers, and just this guy who turned out to have lied. We don't know what the FBI would have announced, but you don't give the FBI. Maybe you redact some stuff for the public, but you sure don't do it for the FBI. So he was lying, and my question is, who was paying him to lie? Why did Sean? Was it the DNC? Was it somebody else? And why did it take a year and a half for the truth to come out? Why did why did Adam Schiff continue the line of the Russian meddling when he knew that they had not, there was no evidence that they had stolen these DNC emails? So a lot of political corruption there.
Absolutely. I also wanted to turn to the Trump Tower meeting. So this is where Natalia Veselnitskaya comes in. She was a pretty notorious figure in American media for a while there. She was a party to this meeting. She was the lawyer for Dennis Katzev in the Prevezon case, which Browder brought. That's in the Southern District of New York. We were talking about this with Alex Craner a few days ago. Lucy, the Prevezon case, that's where this started to enter into the American legal system. Can you please give us some background on that case? What led to it?
What it started out with, there's the real story and then there's the public story. It started out with Browder being in the orchestrating, I think, and I've written about that too, a massive $230 million from the Russian Treasury. The tax refund fraud was you pretend that you have lost money because you set up some shell companies, you sue you, they say, you promised in the contract to do this and you didn't do it and we lost this much money. In this case, we lost $1 billion. And you say, oh, you're so right, and we will pay you. and of course nothing ever gets paid. But then they file with the tax authority to say, well, we paid $230 million on $1 billion profit, and we now had to pay out in this lawsuit, so we are requesting back the money. And it got sent back, and then it disappeared through all kinds of financial networks. That is what Browder wanted to muddy up. What he did was go first to Preet Bharara, who is very corruptly involved in this, and get him to bring a suit by the Justice Department based on documents that Browder supplied. Actually, in testimony, the Justice Department investigator admitted that they started with only documents that Browder supplied, and he was asked in a deposition, how did he check it? On the internet. He checked these things on the internet, and a lot of them were bank documents. He was asked in a deposition, did he go check the banks? And he said, no, they were foreign banks. And the questioner, who's John Moscow, who's very funny, as well as being very smart, said, oh, really? Does your phone go long distance? They never checked out anything. Basically, they were the proxy for Browder. They needed to have some way to throw up a smokescreen and to attack the Russians. And Katsov, of course, was a private investor, mostly in real estate, nothing to do with the Russians, except that his father was an official of the Russian railroads. So this, of course, means that Putin must have known all about it, right? So they went after him. They found something like, I think it was about maybe 6 million out of the 230, by the way. They got investments. They said that he had invested in the U.S. and elsewhere, and that the money had come from this theft. It turns out, by the way, that his company hadn't been started until after the theft, which was at the end of 2007. But that doesn't matter. So this case went on for a couple of years. Partly, at this point, about a year was Browder tried to throw out the law firm that Magnitsky, that John Moscow worked at, because Moscow a couple of years earlier had represented him in an investigation. Nothing related to this case. That went on for a year. He mostly wanted to say everything. The law firm was thrown out. They got a new law firm. And so the case was about to go to trial, and finally the Justice Department agreed to settle it for about $6 million. Now, why did they settle it? The other side, the Dennis Katsov side, said, this is costing us millions of dollars. Lawyers are expensive. We just can't afford this. That's why they settled it. Now, the Justice Department has very deep pockets. It doesn't worry about having to pay lawyers. It's its own lawyers. They settled it. Why did they settle it? They didn't have any evidence. That's why they settled it. They would never settle. Do you think this great case that had gone on for several years, and in this current climate, to show that these Russians were really bad guys and we could figure out somehow to connect it to Putin, they settled it? They had no evidence. It's the same reason they dropped the Russian meddling of the GRU case. They dropped it. They had no evidence. They had to drop this and settle because they had no evidence. But this case took up a lot of attention, and it was mostly the effort of Browder to create a smokescreen around the case and say, these are the guys that did it, not me. And that was the reason for the case.
I think you're absolutely right. That's a very interesting take. It's also the law firm that you were mentioning that was disqualified. That's Baker Hostetler, right?
Right.
Yes. Just trying to get back into it. It's been a little while. Obviously, I was covering the story with Lee, previous host on the show. We got deep into it. He knows it a bit better than I do, but I know enough where I'm just trying to reconcile myself with that knowledge. Anyway, one last point here. I mentioned Rima Starova right at the beginning of this segment. You were talking about how the sort of cause of all this stuff were these tax fraud perpetrated by Bill Browder and his companies. And I believe this was centered in the Kalmykia region. Rima Starova, can you please just briefly, we only have about a minute left, so again, this is going to have to be very brief, but when did Rima Starova come in? Maybe 30 seconds, actually.
She became the fake name of the company Nova Browder shell companies, which were used in this tax refund fraud. She lived in Russia. The shell company was Pluton that was based in British Virgin Islands. She saw an article in a local paper, Commerçant, that said that the Russian investigators were looking into these shell companies and how they had been used. And she knew that they had been involved in this corrupt tax refund fraud. She was afraid they would come to her because the company that she was the fake name head director of had taken over the companies. She went to the police and told them everything she knew about the use of these companies.
And
that's
that's Lucy Commissar. Again, we only have a little bit of time there. Thank you so much for joining us, Lucy. Again, if anybody wants to look into Rima Starova, you can find more info about that, as well as this whole story, as well as other stories, at Lucy Commissar's website, thecommissarscoop.com. Great interview. Great to catch up, Lucy. Thanks so much for joining us. She is an investigative journalist focusing on corporate and financial corruption. Again, you can follow her on Twitter at Lucy Commissar, and her website is thecommissarscoop.com. Another great hour coming up. Be back in just a minute. Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan.
Listening to Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Fault Lines.
Live from just outside of Washington, D.C., we're in the capital of the incited states of America. It is time now for the show that brings you more diverse views on the issues that really matter. In the adamantly independent corner, I am investigative analyst and political theorist Shane Stranahan.
In the left corner, you have indefatigable, ever vigilant political analyst Jamal Thomas.
That's right. Get ready for the show that is your that is your antidote to propaganda. We're both anecdotal and into data. It's Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. All right. Let's do the news. European Union officials are racing to agree on who can visit the bloc, the EU, as of July 1st. It's based on how countries of origin are faring with the new coronavirus cases, and according to a draft list seen by the New York Times, Americans so far are excluded. Americans will be excluded from visiting the European Union. Again, this has to do with the coronavirus, and I'm guessing we as the epicenter don't seem to be doing so well to these countries.
We're not. To put it in perspective, the Trump administration has ended support for 7 testing sites in Texas at the end of this month. Simultaneously, Texas Children's Hospital is now taking adult patients as coronavirus cases rise. We're not doing well.
That's not a good thing. That's not a good thing at all. Twitter has put a public interest notice on a tweet of Trump's in which Trump addressed the Black House Autonomous Zone. In the tweet, Trump said, quote, "There will never be an autonomous zone in Washington, D.C. as long as I'm your president. If they try, they will be met with force," end quote. This is the second time Twitter has put one of these public interest notices on a Trump tweet. The first time was as a response to speech. They said, quote, "glorified violence," end quote. This time they're saying it's because the tweet contains, quote, "the presence of a threat of harm against an identifiable group," end quote. These notices don't prevent Twitter users from viewing the tweet. Just as a brief aside, although we were talking earlier, I was hearing that the first tweet that had this notice put on it was sort of shadow banned. You know, you could technically find it if you went to his feed, but it was a little bit ghosted on social media. I might be wrong about that, though. That's just what I heard.
Okay. That's fair. That's fair. I appreciate the clarification.
Totally. The noose in Bubba Wallace's garage was apparently a garage door pull rope that had been in the shared garage since October 2019. So the story I'll go back to 2 days ago. Bubba Wallace, the only full-time black driver for NASCAR, who a couple of weeks ago had pushed successfully to get Confederate flags removed from NASCAR events. Bubba Wallace, a couple days ago, said that he found a noose in his garage. The next day, NASCAR rallied around him as a community. There was a not a parade, I don't know exactly what to call it, a show of unity by NASCAR.
It's like a march.
Exactly.
All of them were marching behind his car as he drove. and all of the drivers and everything else. Honestly, it is a heart. I don't know. It fills my heart to see that. It really does. And I tend to be somewhat cynical. And the shows of performative and all that, I love that. And so it's a little weird for it to end this way. But at the very least, he knows where he stands in regards to NASCAR. So that's positive.
I hear you. Yeah. So that just the last thing there, the FBI was the agency that was looking into this and said that apparently it's just a garage door pull rope or something. Anyway, that's the latest on that. Today, the White House is hosting Polish President Andrzej Duda. They will be talking about energy policy, COVID-19 response, and a military agreement that's been brewing between the two countries that would lead to U.S. troops being stationed in Poland. This visit to the United States by the Polish president comes just 4 days ahead of Poland's presidential election, which is taking place on June 28th. Washington State announced yesterday. What's up?
No, I was just going to say we need to get people to review that. I would love to have a conversation about Polish policy because I've been to Poland. I was in Warsaw and I was in this other place on the border of Czech Republic. And having conversations with the people who are there, they're not a fan of Russians. So, and in their minds, honestly, in their heads, they don't have this belief that NATO will protect them. I don't know if this is everybody, but in the conversations I had, there was this kind of strong thought of, yeah, we have no belief in that. I mean, they didn't protect us in the other war when they said they were going to protect us. So they may actually agree with us, meaning the public may be on board for this. We have to look into it a little bit more.
Yeah, that historical perspective, I can totally see that. That's interesting. Good point. Washington State announced Tuesday that it will require people to wear facial coverings in public settings. Governor Jay Inslee reiterated that this will be a legal requirement. The announcement comes after King County, which has been the epicenter of the COVID-19 crisis in the state, officially moved to phase 2 as part of the governor's plan to restart the state's economy. The woman suspected of arson in the burning of the Wendy's in Atlanta, Georgia, Natalie White, has been identified as the girlfriend of Rayshard Brooks, who's a man killed by police in a standoff outside that same Wendy's. Pretty much everybody who's looking at this suspects retaliation as the motive. White was arrested yesterday by the Fulton County Sheriff's Office, where she's facing charges of arson.
A good friend that disapproves but understands. That's
All
that.
right.
I don't know how else to say it. There's this feeling of like, fair enough. I mean, it wasn't Wendy's fault. You know, Wendy's did what any company would do, say, hey, there's somebody in my place. And that's after asking him to move. So, you know, they're not culpable in this situation. So, it's like I get it, where it's just kind of like you're angry at something that took place, but disapprove but understand. That's the best place I'm at.
I hear you. Okay, last story here. The Senate Intelligence Committee wants a government-wide report in 180 days on UFOs. It will be unclassified. And I agree with Jamal. That's going to be a big deal.
That's going to be massive. Can you imagine that? Like, but understand where all this comes from. The New York Times comes out with a bombshell story saying something that everybody in the UFO community already knew was infinitely true. Hey, there's something in our skies that we don't know what they are. Now, when the New York Times runs the story, they go into talking to pilots and everything. In addition to the videos that were released, multiple crafts. I think it was one with the Nimitz, one with, I think I could call it Go Fast. But basically, this wasn't, I saw something in the sky. This was pilots observing a craft for multiple minutes that they have no idea what they are, and the capabilities of it far exceeded anything that we were accustomed to. And those pilots, one of which was flying on 9/11 to protect this country, comes out and does interviews. Multiples. And so you get this thing where, okay, there's something here. Either all of these pilots are lying, because it's not just one or two, there were multiple pilots. Either all of these guys are lying, or there's something there. And the catch becomes, is there something there from the standpoint of us, meaning we have technology that's up there that we're not telling people what it is, or if it's something to do with somebody else. And either one of those scenarios are rather mind-blowing. So
it's
that's
true.
where I'm at.
Yeah, no, it's true. It's an interesting theory. I mean, again, this is where the mind goes. Either it's aliens or it's some government or some agency testing stuff out. And then the idea would be, I guess, that the governments and agencies testing these things out have this kind of weird relationship where they're totally happy with people suspecting that it's aliens just because it kind of covers their own butt.
So that's the other part. But the catch is, do you know what To the Stars Academy is? Tom DeLonge? Tom DeLonge's a rock star that used to work with where is it? What's the name of the group? You'll know the group if I tell you. It used to be a big
wasn't it
name
like the
rock
Beastie
band.
Boys, or something?
It's
or
not
what was
Beastie
it?
Boys. It's
not
it's
Beastie Boys.
it's bigger than Beastie Boys, but he's on Angels and Airwaves now. But it used to be another band.
Oh, Blink 182.
That's it. Blink
Just
182.
Google.
So Tom DeLonge was a big UFO guy, and he contacts some kind of you're not going to believe this, but you can look it for yourself. The Hillary Clinton emails, the Podesta emails, Tom DeLonge is all the way through them, because Podesta was also a big UFO guy. Podesta, in one of the press conferences at the end of his term, I think it was Obama, he said the biggest failure that I have is not being able to get the UFO files disclosed. He was a big UFO guy. So was one of the astronauts. It was several of the astronauts. But the conversations between Tom DeLonge and many of these other people went into this notion of energy and crafts and stuff like that. Tom DeLonge apparently was talking to these kind of governmental sources that supposedly brought him in on this. Now, Tom DeLonge doesn't know anything other than what the government sources said, so you should take that with a certain degree of suspicion anyway. And the spooks that are kind of back there behind him also gives me somewhat pause. By the same token, I do think there's a there. I just don't know what that there is. And it's fascinating when you're kind of just getting into the stuff. So, yeah, I'm glad that they're doing this. I just don't know what happens. I don't know what information they disclose. And even in their disclosing of it, they can constrain what they tell you. So, fascinating times, to put it mildly.
Absolutely. I'm going to wrap headlines here real quick. We can continue the conversation on the other side of this little sound effect. Regardless, though, those are headlines. You were listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. There we go. Yeah, okay, so I'm going to say one phrase. Fermi paradox.
Fermi paradox. Well, right. Why haven't they visited, or why don't we see them? Well, think of it this way. If you were a caveman, let's say for the moment that we went to another planet. And while we're on that other planet, we're using cell phone capabilities because we don't have massive capabilities. We just found this other civilization. We had enough time to get there. If they were using telephones, how would they know that we are there? You know what I'm getting at, right? I mean, they had a research paper out recently that said there could be 27 species in our galaxy that we're just unaware of because we don't have the technological capability to be aware of their presence, or for that matter, the technological capability to get there. But the fact that we are seeing them around our around our UFO, our missile silos, the fact that they're paintings. I mean, one of the major paintings, I can't think of the name of the painting, but there's an alien craft in the painting. There should be nothing flying during that time outside of birds, and yet this person is drawing what looks and seems to be a craft. I guess I'm saying it's there, but your society has been so ensconced in this notion of nothing can get here. Why not? Your technology is, like 100 years old of science. And you're like, with our 200 or our century of science, we are perfectly, completely capable of saying nothing can get here. I think that's a bit of hubris. And the same thing in us that have us going to other places in order to explore and whatnot. It may be the same thing in them. The catch is, what are their technology? How are they thinking about the world? What is their society organized around? Why would they come here? That's the other point. Why? And is it possible that however they're communicating, especially over vast distances, that's assuming anybody's communicating at all, it's not being used in the way that we are thinking it's being used? Like, I guess I'm saying there's a certain degree of hubris in our civilization kind of taking those proclamations. But I feel you. I accept it. I accept it.
I really don't know. That's the thing. I've wondered about this for a long time. I'll put the first, I have three main hypotheses that I'll just throw out as little toy models or toy explanations. The zeroth one, which doesn't fall under these, is that we're just not hearing about it for whatever reason. Like there's, suppression of information, that kind of thing. That's the conspiratorial one. The other three actually aren't conspiratorial. That's the looming one, but I'm just going to move right past that because I kind of don't know how I would resolve that. But these other three, I think, are kind of interesting. So one is this idea of simulationism, where other societies have realized that it's more energy efficient for them to do things in a simulation, through computational power or whatever systems they've built up, and therefore they stay local. Instead of expanding out into space, they get more processing power just by harvesting nearby resources at home, et cetera. Yeah. They get to experience time over longer periods of time. They get to experience more in these simulations. It's like a way of drawing out and intensifying experiences. That's a weird take, but that's one of the ones that I've heard that I thought was interesting.
Another one. Weird at all. I think it's rational. I mean, why are you here? And how do you know you're not being generated by somewhere else?
That's the thing. I mean, that's one of the fundamental questions. And again, that's why a lot of people these days are asking themselves that same question. How do I know that I'm not in a simulation? Elon Musk, pretty prominent dude talking about that within the last couple of years. Another one, maybe I won't have time to get to the third. The second one, it's called the estivation hypothesis, AESTIVATION, the estivation hypothesis or eastivation hypothesis. Basically, the idea is, and this is kind of quirky, it sort of fits in with the simulation thing, but the idea is one of the biggest, most energy intensive problems, practically the biggest one with computing, is cooling it. It takes a lot of energy to cool anything down. The more computations you're doing, the hotter the thing gets, and therefore you need to expend a lot of energy to cool it down. Now here's the thing, what they're saying is that the heat death of the universe as we approach it provides that cooling. And so what the authors of this paper, I'm forgetting their names, what they suspected was that aliens were going around collecting matter in this sort of semi-dormant state and saving it until they would have these natural cooling capacities towards the end of the universe, at which point they would activate all of that matter and energy and use it, and then they would get more of it out of it, if that makes sense. It's just a kind of trippy hypothesis.
Yeah, that was pretty wild. Because it's the level of technology at that point is so massively out of whack with what what people can process.
Exactly. That's the thing. That's why I kind of like that one. It's just so big that it's like, wait, what? Breaks your expectations. Anyway, we're going to go into a break right here. I think we'll be back in just a minute. You've been listening to Trippy Stuff About Aliens with Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan.
Lines. 24 hours a day, 7 daes a week. We give you the most essential information out there. Radio Sputnik, telling the untold.
Feeling kind of blue, but maybe also kind of red, and kind of purple, and kind of alone? You've got a friend on Radio Sputnik. Tune in to Political Misfits from 12 to 2 Eastern Time, Monday through Friday, for news, politics, and culture without the two-party bias. Catch us daily on 105.5 in Washington, D.C., or 102.9 or 104.7 in Kansas City. Or find us on Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, Spotify, or wherever you get your news.
Fault Lines.
And we are back. Again, you're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan, having a variety of conversations about very interesting topics, as I think we try to always. Regardless, though, you can catch us, if you're in Washington, D.C., on 105.5 FM and 1390 AM. That's on the radio. And in Kansas City at 102.9 FM and 104.7 FM. Online, by your computer, tablet, phone, whatnot. You can also hear us on YouTube, Spotify, Spreaker, iHeartRadio, Stitcher, wherever fantastic podcasts can be found. And it's true. And here's the thing.
Podcasts.
We're going into a call-in segment. We've already got a caller, but I want to see if we can get some more. The number to call, if you want to, is 202-521-1320. Again, that's 202-521-1320. Regardless, we're taking calls. We are currently joined by Louise. Louise from Virginia. You just called in. What's on your mind, Louise?
Yes, and after I tell you, please don't hang up on me because I need to listen to you on the telephone. I'm calling from Northern Virginia. I listen to you on the radio. It's much better to listen on the radio because you can do other things with your hands, of course. My radio reception has been terrible from the beginning. I can barely hear you through the static, so I've been hanging on the caller section for the whole morning, listening to you through my telephone, because that's how I can hear you. I've told Andre about it. He says he can't do anything, so I'm hanging on the phone for two reasons: to listen to you, which I do every morning, of course, and to hopefully my voice will go out to someone to tell them that the static is just overwhelming and torture to listen to, and could they please fix it? That's assuming people don't know about it already, and that I will be alerting them to it.
Louise, may I ask you, where are you listening to this from the radio from? What location?
In Northern Virginia. Do you want to know the city right away?
I'm just curious on whether or not it may just be out of range.
Oh, well, it might be. If it's it hasn't been out of range before. This is the first time it's happened.
Oh,
I'm listening to you from.
Okay.
That's weird. That's sad to hear. Thank you for letting us know about that. I've heard about this a long time ago, but it's been a while since this seems to have come up. And I suppose it's good for other listeners in the area, if they've been having a hard time too, maybe call in, let us know possibly.
We also have 1390 AM locally, if I'm not mistaken. I mean, you can try that one, but I'm not sure how we can fix that per se.
That's the thing. Yeah, no, I'm not sure what we can do either. Regardless, we have that's Louise.
Thank you, though, Louise. I appreciate it. What is this? Tarek from Georgia? What's going on, Tarek?
Hey, I love you guys. But this is I was calling because of basically the UFO topic.
Yes.
And I was explaining to the guy before he plugged me in is that there's been a real change in how the media, especially cable news, media covers the UFO topic. Typically they cover it, the UFO files kind of jokingly, but now there's been like a real shift. And my question is, why the shift? Why now have our pilots say, hey, we need to there's better ways to, fill out forms for when we do see this. Why is it now being taken seriously? And now they're not. I mean, these meetings could have been classified. So why are they now making these things public, saying, "Hey, our senators are actually having meetings about these things," because they didn't cover it like that in the past?
Oh, thank you, Tarek. I'm glad you asked that question. That's a fantastic question. So there are different reasons, or there are different thoughts. On the overt sense, you basically had videos slammed into the public, where these are UFOs, they're clearly engaging with the U.S. military, and you need to explain that. And so the Pentagon found out, basically the Pentagon released these. At first, the Pentagon said, we didn't do it. And oftentimes there's this weird two-step where it seems that they release information, but they release it in a way where they always have the ability to give a no in case the public takes it wrong, because whatever you put out, you're stuck with. Meaning, if you say aliens are eating babies, you're stuck with that. And so you can't say anything bombastic. Often we see a craft. How are the public going to respond? Okay, here's the military personnel to talk about it. But you also have factions that are working in concert that want to get this stuff out, and you have other factions that don't believe it should be out. And so it's like anything else where you have these kind of pressures that are pushing to it and fro. Now, the larger question, is there something going on that they decided, let this go? And the question even further, who is they that would make that decision? I don't know about that. I have no powers to know that. All I know is that there seemed to be a concerted push to get the information out. This information slammed into the press. Grant Cameron had talked about it like a year in advance that this information was going to come out. I think the expectation was that Hillary was going to win, and that with Hillary winning, she was going to be open to it because she's mentioned that she was open to it. Whereas instead, you got Trump. And so you have this kind of weird push for the information to get out without the government entirely being on board for it. But in this case, the government gets on board for it. I don't know how your government explains that. You have a craft. What is that? Where is that coming from? We have no idea. It takes all of this kind of quantum mechanics to make that stuff work. How does it work? We have no idea. Well, at some point, the government has to answer that. And so you can't have but so many of these videos being released with your military acknowledging, yes, we were seeing craft that we didn't know what they were, before your government is stuck with the thing of, okay, now we'd explain it. Now, your question is, why now? And I don't have an answer to why now. It's just theories or hypotheses into why now as opposed to other times. But, that's a fascinating question, man. We have James from Virginia. I can talk about UFOs all day. People say I look like a younger man when I'm talking about UFOs. So let's not, we don't want to tarry too much on that. James from Virginia, how's it going, man?
He's gone.
So what's the topic for today?
Oh, sad. Yeah, James dropped. I was thinking, this is a random topic. We're talking about life. We're talking about life in the universe.
Yeah.
There's this idea, Schrodinger, from Schrodinger's cat. He wrote this book, What is Life? He's talking about entropy. And he said life, in some sense, is this inversion. He was describing life. It's this weird inversion of entropy.
Yeah. Most things collapse. Life is an organization of energy of sorts.
That's the thing. And then a lot of people will sort of spiritualize this in different ways. But it's just intrinsically interesting if you look at it. Entropy, which is like this universal constant that increases with time, inevitably, inexorably, always. The one exception to that, as far as I can tell, is this increasingly ordered complex of matter that we call life. It's just this interesting inversion. And so, I don't know. That's, again, it's a philosophical take, but a lot of what we value in life, I think, can be brought back down to that sort of weird, miraculous inversion of what we would anticipate.
It is. It's an act of will. I mean, basically, if you're talking about any level of organization where people are bringing themselves together to do something, you can take it spiritually. That's that the universe is biased towards love, and that love being some level of cooperation in order to make larger things. I mean, think of the human body. Cells, organs, tissue, all of that stuff in order to make this matter that can observe itself and contemplate its universe. And even from that standpoint, the ability to build technology that allows the person to extend their lifespan, to live longer, to go out into the universe. Like, you're right. It's a weird inversion in the sense of what is typical in our society in regards to the things to devolve and where life has the potential to continue. It's fascinating. But I'm sorry, James in Virginia. I'm sorry. Continue,
No.
James.
That's exactly the kind of response I wanted, because I didn't know what you were going to say. Wasn't expecting it. Carry the conversation forward.
We always have these good conversations. So
yeah.
It's, we could be sitting in a coffee shop somewhere.
Totally. You know what? I'm going to tie that in because we're bringing Manila Chan on next. There's this interesting perspective. If that's what life is, and life has this cycle, and I'm going to bring this into society and politics in a second. You go through this growth phase, and then you sort of revert in some sense to the universal norm. Your body starts to decay. Things fall apart. The center doesn't hold, and eventually you die. And again, I think we can take aspects of that. There are problems with looking at society or politics as an organism. There are noted problems where that gets pretty fascist pretty quickly. But there's some merit to it too. And if we look at society, I think we've been talking about these issues of stagnation in a political space, of the unaccountability that the American government has had. It's a problematic stuff. It's a problematic situation. But again, I think you can apply the same lens to it. The system went through a period of growth, and now it is sort of returning to that entropy. And a lot of the chaos we're seeing in our society is a result of that. And I think in that way, there's an interesting opportunity for a lot of people to come alive. And it's just a matter of what kinds of lives we want to lead in that society, what kind of society we want to create.
I agree totally with you. I mean, most of the time, like, the notion of infinite growth is obscene. It doesn't exist. All societies, as far as we know, have grown and died. Just like all systems, be it, the feudalism, or be it, kings and queens and whatnot. Like, those systems eventually collapse. Slavery was another system. The propagation of that system goes into capitalism, basically just, a tweak that instead of having people forced to work on a plantation, with the exception of prisoners and inmates, you have people who basically choose to work on a plantation for a certain salary. Those systems grow old and die. I think it's like, I don't think the notion that we're going to have a system that goes on in perpetuity unless you have a sustainable system. Meaning, if you had a system in a society that was basically sustainable in regards to what human beings need to grow and flourish, that system would be far more stable than the one that we have now. Maybe that's something that we grow into to figure out before we either die out in the process.
That's the thing. There's this idea. I think I'm going to go into a break a little bit early here, just so we can get Manila Chan, who called in early. Very happy to have her on the line. We want to go into that. But I also, my brief point here is, we go through that. I don't know. I'm going to come back to it. Interesting conversation, very interesting conversation. Regardless, we're going to be back in just a minute here with Manila Chan. You've been listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan.
Fault lines. Tough questions are the most powerful weapon we have. As long as you have questions, we'll keep asking. Radio Sputnik, telling the untold.
Tune in every Thursday to Loud and Clear with Brian Becker for a regular segment called Criminal Injustice, about the most egregious conduct of our courts and how justice is denied to so many people in this country. Tune in to Loud and Clear this Thursday and every Thursday for thorough and independent analysis of our criminal injustice system.
Fault Lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines. My name is Jamal Thomas. I'm here with my co-host, Shane Stranahan. Of course, you can listen to us from the beating heart of America in Washington, D.C. from 7 a.m. to 12 a.m. at 105.5 FM and 1390 a.m. You can also catch us in Kansas City at 102.9 FM and also 104.7 FM. If you have any comments, you can give us a call, 202-521-1320. Now, to discuss, we have a great person here today. Basically, veteran news anchor, host of RT America Daily's news program, In Question, and host of one of my favorite shows on RT, Manila Chan. Welcome to the show. Thank you for joining us.
Hi, guys. Well, thank you very much. I'm happy to hear that you watch. Thank you.
Absolutely. So, pretty expansive question, but I know you can answer it. How do you view what has been taking place in America, meaning the millions of people in the streets, the sudden shift in U.S. perspective on race, especially within the context of the cops, the visible attacks on protesters, the 40 million people out of a job, the coming evictions and bankruptcies? What do you consider to be the terrors and the potentials of everything, this kind of churning part that is America right now?
I think it was a long time coming. I mean, having worked in news both domestically and internationally. You saw uprisings, like, for example, in the Middle East, when you saw the Arab Spring, a bunch of, obviously, led by younger Middle Easterners looking for change in their society. I think we're seeing the same thing here, but I think this has been a long time coming. I would say since mid-90s, probably, when I was about coming of age, and during the Clinton era, and the crime bill from 94, post 1992 LA riots, which I lived through, and I remember I lived a few miles away from all of that happening. But you could kind of sense all of that was brewing ever since, in my younger days. I think being a part of in my age group, the last part of Gen X, we were kind of apathetic to actually make anything happen. So I think what we're seeing now is a millennial and Gen Z-led version of the Arab Spring, because they want to see societal change. And I think a lot of people in my age group, Gen Xers, support that as well, because of these types of police reforms that have dramatically changed how certain communities across America are able to live, are able to raise their children. The quality of life has been greatly impacted because of Clinton-era policies. So I think we're seeing that finally come to fruition after, close to 30 years in the making.
That's interesting. I agree with you, by the way. Basically, I think I like to call it a deficit that's being paid off right now, basically, for all of these people who are either ill, not having cash, living from paycheck to paycheck, and their condition got worse. I mean, significantly so. And you have this kind of response. I think they went back and forth in a political system from either Democrat and Republican looking for some solution. And when it became clear there was no solution out there, they fled into the streets. This brings me to a different point, though. The defund the police movement brought me to the mindset that the issue is poverty. I know they were saying defund the police, defund the police, defund the police, but I really do think that gets to the reason of why the cops are there. And if you look statistically at crime stuff, you get to the issue of poverty. From the standpoint of African Americans, the poverty has a chain that is basically forged going all the way back to the last several hundreds of years. So can you explain the role that slavery had in building our current world? This was something that you had went over once before, and I would love to hear you kind of explain it here.
I mean, I'm definitely no expert on American history, much less specifically slavery, but from all the people, the brilliant people I've had the opportunity of interviewing for the years, and also a history professor at Baruch College in New York, more recently on my show, she shed a lot of light on the impacts of slavery on the Black community today, obviously with hundreds of years of slavery, similar to generational wealth that is passed down. You can compare that to generational poverty as well. Obviously, the Black community, I would say, started out, in 1865 with the Emancipation Proclamation. You found millions of people that were suddenly free, and many of them were unskilled, uneducated, and kind of left. There was no plan to, once these people were free, there was no infrastructure put there to like we would today. Say if groups of people were shut down from a factory, we would teach them new skills, right? We would take them to, there's different types of labor schools that you can go to and learn a new trade and learn a new craft. We didn't have that in place back then in 1865. And while obviously the Emancipation Proclamation was a wonderful thing, because slavery is one of the most disgusting things that I think humanity has ever faced, America didn't have infrastructure in place to help those people do more with their. So I think you can see a lot of that now passed down. I mean, I'm not from any kind of generational wealth myself. My family, I'm a child of refugees. I'm the first American born in my family. Yeah. So I can speak to that, starting from a deficit, But that's when you kind of have to bust your butt and really knuckle down and focus on what you want, not so much what you don't have. There's a lot of people that start out nothing and start out from a deficit. And I know this pain for the African American community runs deeper than me being, a first generation American. But at the same time, there are things that should have been put in place for the community, the way they had for new immigrants, for example, that came in the wave of the post-Vietnam War from Southeast Asia. But obviously, we came to that place in the 70s through trial and error, right? We didn't just know off the bat that, hey, this is something we should do. We should put infrastructure in to help these people, help them along the way. They're new here. They don't speak the language. They don't, X, Y, Z. We didn't have that in the 1800s or the turn of the century into the 1900s. We just weren't sophisticated back then. So the question is now, how do you put the plug on generational poverty and this generational deficit? How do you start that? Some people are talking about reparations. And I know you guys have talked about that on the show and privately. But I don't think having people today paying sins of the father is a fair thing to do either. So I don't know. What do you guys think?
Just to interrupt for a moment. The refugee thing is a little different. I mean, refugees weren't necessarily exploited for labor. I mean, I guess you can say the Chinese, fair enough. But all things being equal, that's a radically different situation. I mean, refugees who came to the country made the choice to come to the country. African Americans weren't. Also, I think it's something different also from the standpoint of labor. It's not the issue of giving something away. It's more so paying a debt that's owed. There's somewhat of a difference in those things. I mean, this country was able to basically grow and flourish as a result of labor that for hundreds of years. And then on top of that, then you get Jim Crow, and then you get redlining, and you get all of these things that basically going up into like the 80s and 90s where they're excluded from positions in the economy, excluded from housing positions. I do think from the context of a debt, and look, this is me coming from somebody who was against the notion of reparations that came around to this conclusion because otherwise there is no way to get rid of the generational wealth gap. I mean, the race gap. There's like a 10-to-1 difference in regards to the deficit. And the difference between whites and blacks. I mean, I think it's like 176,000 to 18,000. And that number gets worse when you get into like people who don't have a bachelor degree, etc. I agree with you that reparations is somewhat of a heavy haul in the sense that I don't entirely know what that looks like. But is it fair to say that there has to be something to balance it? It's not really the people. It's no longer, it's not like a vampire that you kind of punch in the stomach and take money out of his pocket. The thing that instituted this was the U.S. government. The government was the one that decided that we were going to put people as human beings. They decided to put people as slaves. They decided to set the laws. Shouldn't that government also have some responsibility in compensating the descendants who basically did that labor and basically was taken advantage of without giving any compensation for it?
I mean, that's exactly the conversation of reparations, right? Yeah. I still, personally, again, you can say that refugees chose to come here, but in a way, they didn't want to leave their war-torn country. No, most people, if they're in a good situation in their country, they don't want to leave.
I agree.
They're from.
No, that I agree with you on. That I wholeheartedly agree. I mean, because you get into this whole, you can get into Guatemala. Should there be reparations for Guatemala? Should there be reparations for Syria and the killing of all those people? Iraq? Oh, man, like it opens a can of worms. Don't misunderstand me. And I guess I'm not necessarily against it, but go ahead. I'm sorry.
That's not fair either, right? I mean, America has an ugly racist history no matter what color it's applied to. Even with white people, there are white people that were basically, I guess history doesn't define them as slaves, but there are white Irishmen that were brought here that were basically slaves as well. So every color has had some sort of ugly, institutionalized racism, racist law applied to them. maybe not to the scale and to the decades and generations for Black Americans. But if you look at, for example, like the Chinese Exclusion Act, also in the late 1800s, this is after the Emancipation Proclamation, I believe, what was that, President Hoover? The Chinese Exclusion Act, I mean, there are people that look like me, who were born here in this country like me, that were also kicked out. You look at World War II, you look at the Japanese internment camps, that should there be reparations for that? At some point, America just has to come to grips with its ugly racist history and try to move forward from there. But forward doesn't mean looking back and saying, okay, we should pay you for all of this. I mean, I don't think realistically America has the financial fortitude to do that. I mean, we just picked up $500 billion of debt because of the coronavirus in the course of 3 or 4 months now, right?
Right.
Realistically, we're not. I'm somebody that looks forward to solutions that are realistic and that are practical.
You mentioned the Japanese for the moment. The Japanese got paid $1.6 billion in reparations. The American that had interned, they actually did get reparations.
I don't seem to remember that, because I know a lot of Japanese Americans I'm from Los Angeles, so I know a lot of Japanese people whose grandparents were in the internment camps. So if it was applied to them, nobody's ever told me about it.
So it said the legislation admitted that the government actions were based on race prejudice, war hysteria, and the failure of the political leadership. The U.S. government eventually disbursed more than $1.6 billion, equivalent to $3.4 billion today in reparations to 82,219 Japanese Americans who have been interned and their heirs. We've done it before.
When the fact that they did that, again, it's probably because it's a more modern time, it's a smaller amount of people, and it was something that was doable. And that goes back to my point from just a minute ago, that practical, if it's doable, I mean, because we know better. It's in modern times. It's in the 20th century. We know better now.
No, I totally understand. So let's go to the politics of it. Because basically Joe Biden, the person who created this criminal justice system, by putting these laws in place, is now running for president and potentially may choose Kamala Harris, who also was instrumental in pretty horrible criminal justice stuff in California, maybe his running mate. This just seems so tone deaf to me. Are Democrats just not getting it, or they just don't care at this point? Like, what am I missing here? It seems like you have a very big moment. You have a huge number of people that aren't working, a huge number of people that get kicked out of their houses. And in this moment, the best thing they could do is Cobra with a Republican Democrat president who basically seems out of touch and saying not much is going to change, and a Republican president that is bragging about slowing down testing. This seems like a recipe for disaster.
With the Democrats putting forward, number one, they sidelined Bernie again. DNC sidelined Bernie again. He was probably the only one, I mean, maybe a little bit of Elizabeth Warren, a little bit, but not quite like Bernie. Bernie also didn't have the momentum that he had in 2016, but still, he had much more support and momentum and fervor for his campaign than Joe Biden ever had. But the DNC, Joe Biden is the anointed one. I've covered politics for the bulk of my career. This is Bernie. If it were Bernie, that's just not the way politics is played.
Yeah.
Biden is next in line. He kind of sucks. Let's be honest. He sucks, especially because of the crime bill. And you can feel sorry for him for all these horrible life tragedies that have happened to him, and say, well, at least he's not Trump. But is that really any way a party should move a candidate forward, is just because he's not Trump or he's so-called better than Trump? If you look at the things he's voted for wars, for the crime bill that has literally altered entire families and generations of families in the last 40 years. I mean, in the time I've been alive, I know people where I'm from in the East LA area Black and brown people whose families have been altered forever because of that crime bill and the 3 strikes law. And, while those have all been repealed, it still doesn't change that these people come out. You guys know this. You have a criminal record, you can't get a job, you can't this, that, and the other thing, and it goes on and on and on, right? And you stay in, the poor neighborhood with the bad education. Joe Biden was instrumental in that. Kamala Harris, when she was in Sacramento, she did her fair share of putting people that look just like her, people that are Black and brown, in prison, because when you're an attorney general, when you're an attorney, you get points for how many cases you win. Whether they're fair or right or truly just is irrelevant.
That's Manila Chan. We're talking about the issue of criminal justice reform, also the 2020 elections. We're talking about this before. Biden versus Trump, the 1994 Crimes Act. A lot more to continue on there. Regardless, we'll be back with Manila in just a second. On the other side of this break, you've been listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan.
Fault lines. We are talking
24 hours a day, 7 days a week.
You are listening.
We give you the most essential out of the endless information space.
Radio Sputnik, telling the untold.
Are you bored? Are you lonely? Do you need a hug? Well, we can't give you that, but we can keep you up to date on Radio Sputnik.
Fault lines.
And we are back with Manila Chan. For the very few people who in our audience who haven't heard of her, Manila is a veteran news anchor and host of RT America's daily news program, In Question. We're talking about criminal justice reform, the 2020 elections. We were talking about reparations, and I'm actually going to go back there for a second. I was kind of staying out of it because, I have stuff to say, but I didn't want that to become my conversation. But here's my take, and it's kind of a slightly right-wing take from my perspective, although it's weird because you're arguing for reparations. If I look back at American history, and this is something I've been saying on the air, if I look back at American history, America, as far as I can tell, is unique among countries in being founded on principles. Now, we have misapplied those principles, but I think we're still viewing the lens through the world of those principles, and I think we should be grateful for that. We moved from aristocracy, monarchy, oligarchy. Okay, we still have some oligarchy, but we've at least formally, we've sort of moved beyond those things. And I think that, again, the principles that we're applying, value life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness, freedom, individuality, equality, I think all of those are really important. And I think in an existential sense, for us as a nation, and again, this is kind of a right-wing perspective in a weird way, as somebody who loves America and really values America, I think we need to really reconsider how we've applied those values and kind of come back to those values, come back to those principles. And if I look at our history, there are 2 or 3 major categories where we've erred. I'll just split it into 2 categories. There is how we have dealt with various racial minorities, including Native Americans, including Black Americans who are slaves, including the Japanese in the internment camps. And then there is this history of American imperialism. And I think that the history of American imperialism has gotten a lot more concentrated in the last century, but it's this ongoing history. And I think that there are these countervailing forces that oppose those, transgressions of values. I mean, people have been critical of American imperialism for as long as we've been doing it. People have been trying to push for the abolition of slaves, as far as I can tell, for longer than America existed. There are these trends, and I think that in a real sense, for us to sort of save our country, we need to come back to those principles. And I think that reparations is a large part of that. I think that, like everybody who's looking at this knows, there's this legacy, this economic legacy of lack that never got filled. Very, very meager attempts were made to fill it. There's another aspect of this I've been talking about, where you have the civil rights movement in the 50s and the 60s, and then about end of the 60s, early 70s, you have the Nixon shock. Anyway, in the coming decades, you have this offshoring and outsourcing of jobs. Now, a lot of the jobs that got outsourced or offshored, those would have gone to Black Americans. Those would have been pretty stable factory and manufacturing jobs that would have acted as a sort of economic foundation for the Black community. That's another conversation slightly, but I think that there are different ways that we've been negligent of our responsibilities from this larger principled perspective. And again, I think it's a slightly weird perspective, but I think that's what we need to do. What's your take on that, Manila?
I'm actually kind of on your side there. I mean, I try to be as neutral as I can, obviously on my show, because the show is not about my opinion. Here, I mean, I'm allowed to at least kind of voice my opinion a little bit more. But I'm with you on that, because if you look at the early 2000s in what we would now consider, obviously, the Rust Belt, that is rife with communities that are full of opioids and alcoholism and broken families and battered women. That all came about in the early 2000s when American corporations were incentivized to move their businesses and their manufacturing to China. Those communities that flipped from historically blue states, they flipped for Trump because of, what he was preaching, what he was stumping about making America first and making America great again. And he talked about, he's obviously a businessman. So I think that influenced a lot of people in places like Pennsylvania, for example, that lost a lot of manufacturing, for example, like in Pittsburgh. Those areas flipped to him because he was saying things that they needed to hear. They needed to look for the future that maybe manufacturing might come back. Maybe American cars will come back. Maybe there's a chance for, maybe I'm too old now, but maybe my son will be able to get a good solid factory job manufacturing whatever. But it's because America has failed in those, just like you said, Shane, America has failed in looking at those communities that tend to be either poor white, Black, or Hispanic. America has failed to put in institutions that can help the children, whether you're a descendant of a slave or a child of migrant laborers. America has failed to fill those gaps after, especially the early 2000s, after all the manufacturing jobs went away, that would have, like you said, would have gone to the offspring of former slaves or great grandchildren of slaves. America has really failed in putting something there to, whether it's some kind of trade school, technical school, ways to help the community. If we're not going to give reparations, America should have looked at doing something like that to propel the generations forward. If there's nothing you can do for the past, and you want to leave the past in the past, then invest in young people and children for the future. That is where America has completely failed. And I haven't heard any presidential candidate, maybe with the exception of Bernie Sanders, of raising communities of various colors up by forward thinking versus looking back.
That's a large context of history, a large context of events as they take place, especially when you're paying attention to them as they're propagating themselves around the world. What does this become? I mean, the moment that all of these people get evicted and everything else, I strongly suspect that there's going to be a different tint or a different perspective shift in the number of people who are out there marching. But from your experience, what becomes of America in, let's say, August, September, at the very least, going forward in the year?
Well, right now, Biden is leading in the polls by the double digits. Yeah. Generally speaking, across the country, we know this is going to be a two-man race. I mean, I don't want to disrespect Howie Hawkins of the Green Party or what have you, but realistically, it is a two-man race.
Wait, you're saying Howie Hawkins is not going to win? Oh, I'm I'm crushed. No, I'm teasing. I'm sorry. I like
Howie. He's a nice guy.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, I think there's not enough momentum behind Howie. So I wish Howie luck, but I think it's really ultimately going to be a two-man race. It'll be Biden versus Trump. It'll be how much. Well, here's the thing. Biden would have a lot more support from from the moderates, from both parties, actually, because there are moderate Republicans who despise Trump. There are old school by the book who hate Trump. They don't want to vote for him. Now, Biden, that we knew as a senator, I think he could have garnered a lot of votes from moderates, both on the left and on the right. The Biden that we're seeing now, who may be pandering to the left and yielding to far left voices and cries, I think he stands to really disenfranchise a huge chunk of America that is moderate. But now, what's the other option? You vote Trump, or you don't vote at all? So I think right now the polls, we couldn't trust them in 2016. We saw what happened in 2016. The polls had Hillary ahead in massive double digits, but they were all wrong, every single one of them, including 538, who Nate Silver is an amazing prognosticator. But I mean, wow.
Yeah,
wow, was he wrong?
I remember on Huffington Post had Hillary Clinton winning by like 98% chance on the day she lost. It was some obscene number, like it was an obscene metric. I'm curious, what do you mean when you say Biden has reached out to the left? What do you see as Biden's reaching out to the left that may disenfranchise moderates?
I think yielding to the pressures of what people would view as, the moderates would view, I know as a news person that there are protesters and then there are rioters and then there are people that are mobs out there.
Yeah.
If he presents himself, if he doesn't play this right, if he presents himself as yielding to the mob, yielding to, whatever the extreme far left wants, there are a lot of moderate, or Democrats rather, a lot of moderate Democrats who dislike AOC, who dislike BLM, just want to return the country to a sense of normalcy, pre-Trump, right? There are a lot of people that have their qualms with the Obama era as well, in terms of foreign policy, but that's a different conversation. A lot of the country, I think, wants to see the country return back to a sense of normalcy pre-Trump, where we can quietly discuss amongst ourselves, community to community, on how to address, racial inequality, how to address redlining. I also have a background in real estate in Los Angeles, and I can tell you as a real estate agent how those were being addressed in Los Angeles. Yeah. That was left to the community, right? Like America is, you can't look at it as this one big chunk. If Joe Biden builds too far to the left and thinks that this is what's popular, he is going to disenfranchise a lot of moderate voters, and they won't have a place to go. Either they will stay at home, or they might go for Trump because they're like, well, I don't want, all this looting and rioting to happen in my community. And it seems like Joe Biden is yielding to them, even though they don't like.
I see.
The options are terrible. 2020. This is terrible.
So you're associating, okay, I see. I think I understand. You're saying the rioting and the mob is the elements of the far left, not necessarily that policy per se. Am I understanding that right?
That's right. That's what it looks like to a lot of the average voter somewhere in the Midwest. That's what it appears like to most people. So if you start yielding too much to BLM, BLM, I would characterize it as, if you compare it to maybe the Tea Party from 10 years ago, the rise of the Tea Party, right? It started out as this super right conservative movement, and then it kind of became its own political party. I think BLM is kind of headed in the same direction, but for the left. So if you start yielding to either of those groups, whether it was 10, 12 years ago when the Tea Party launched versus now, and you're seeing BLM get some momentum. I think the moderate average Joe is going to be very put off by that. And if Biden yields to that, he might make those people end up just staying home because they don't want to vote for Trump either.
Thank
so
you.
By staying home,
I can kind of appreciate that. I think the Tea Party ends up winning. I mean, they were able to take power, but fair enough. To discuss the great conversation, I really do appreciate you coming on to the show. To RT, America's daily news program, In Question, and veteran news anchor, Manila Chan. Thank you for joining us, Manila.
Thank you, guys.
Absolutely.
Thanks so much, Manila.
Well,
you
Shane,
can follow
another
Manila
show
on
for
Twitter.
Another show on the belt.
Great show. Yeah, very interesting conversations. Really glad to be joined by Manila for that conversation. Hopefully we can have her back on soon because there's a lot more to talk about there. Yeah, the reparations thing that got, it gets dramatic a little bit, but I think it's a really important conversation. That's what we're here for.
Yes,
anyway, really appreciate her.
Right?
Yeah. Anybody who wants to follow Manila can follow her on Twitter at Manila Chan. That's MANILACHAN. You can also follow her on Facebook at Manila Chan Reports, and you can watch her on In Question on RT America. Another great show. We're coming back to you tomorrow. Regardless, though, really appreciated everybody listening in. Had a lot of fun here with Jamarl Thomas. I'm Shane Stranahan, and we're signing off. You've been listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan.
Guys, I appreciate you all joining us for the show. Once again, another one down the belt. I think that's like number 4 or 5. We're still fine-tuning. So, some of the stuff like the transitions and everything else, under normal circumstances, we get like dry runs. But in this case, Shane and I had to learn on the fly. And so for the most part, I think we've been doing a pretty decent job, or a pretty good job. Shane has been amazing, so no complaints. I enjoy these shows. These shows have a different quality a little bit. They're more cerebral, which, again, Shane and I kind of gravitate towards. So I hope you guys enjoy it. I mean, it's our show. I think we do a pretty decent show, and it's only going to get better. Like, share, and of course, subscribe. Thanks and shout out to Manila Chan and to all of our guests. I didn't want to badger, and I never want to badger. Like, I never want to be. I wanted to push back, but not necessarily to get so over the top with it. Because Chan, again, is one of my favorite shows on RT. And so it feels weird kind of like, wait a minute. Are you, do you mean that? But no, I thought it was good. I thought we had a good time. The reparations argument, I honestly do believe it's a conversation that needs to take place. I strenuously believe it. Whereas beforehand, I was on the sidelines of this argument, even though I might have silently agreed. At this point, I am off the sidelines. This is a situation where you have a large number of people that are in bad situations that require some level of assistance to yank themselves out of the bad situation. And if we're going to argue about cops, and we're going to talk about crime, and we're going to talk about billions of dollars that we spend putting people in cages and keeping those people in cages and paying cops, well, hey, can we take that billions and put it into making sure those communities are okay? The catch is they're better off. They're more happy with basically using force as opposed to ensuring that the communities are okay. They consider that a handout as opposed to giving all the cops money to beat the hell out of those people. They consider that different. Nevertheless, those conversations need to be had. Like I say, I'm off the sidelines of that reparations conversation. Bob has convinced me. Bob has convinced me on that. It's just right, at least in my opinion. There is no looking forward without looking back. I mean, think about Obama coming in saying, yeah, we're going to let Bush off the hook and we're just going to look forward. It's like, wait a minute, you killed 1 million people. You're not going to own up to the fact that you killed 1 million people, not to mention the war crimes that you guys are running from, the torture that you guys were involved in, the mass surveillance. You're looking forward when the last president committed all of these crimes? Yes. History doesn't, it sticks with itself. So this conversation is a really good one, and I really appreciate her coming on and having the back and forth. I got to be honest, I didn't know she was going to say that. We kind of just fell into the conversation. But it's a good one to have, and it's one that people are going to be having, especially with Black Lives Matter kicking up this much dust. Because even though they're talking about defund the police now, even though that gets the most head play, underneath the defund the police is this notion of using the resources to put into the community. I think the only difference in the way that we talk about it is I start off at, no, use the resources for the community, and defund the police going the other way. Nevertheless, thank you guys for joining us. I guess we're at the after show at this point. Shane Stranahan, my producer, Raheem, and of course, our engineers. Shout out. Not to mention, I guess. I'll see you guys later today. Thanks all. Bye-bye.